Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. The farmhouse was farther out than I expected. I'd followed an old trail that didn't show up on any maps, weaving deeper into the woods than I'd ever been. The trees grew dense and tangled, blocking out most of the afternoon light. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky was already turning gray. The house stood crooked at the edge of the clearing, its roof sagging in the middle. The wood siding was weathered to a dull gray, with vines creeping up the walls like veins. Most of the windows were broken, the door half open, swinging slightly in the breeze. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I hesitated at the threshold, but curiosity got the better of me. The floor creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. Dust hung in the air, catching what little light filtered through the broken windows. Old furniture sat where it had been left, covered in sheets yellowed with age. I made my way through the house slowly, each room emptier than the last. A few personal items were scattered around a cracked mirror, a torn-up shoe, a single cup sitting on a table. It all felt staged somehow, like whoever had lived here had left in a hurry, or hadn't left at all. The cellar door was at the back of the kitchen, half hidden behind a leaning cabinet. It was heavier than I expected, groaning as I pulled it open. Cold air rushed out, damp and smelling faintly of mildew. The stairs were steep and narrow, disappearing into darkness. I clicked on my flashlight and descended carefully, one step at a time. The cellar was wider than it looked from the outside, the walls made of rough stone. Old shelves lined one side, filled with canning jars clouded by age. But it was the far wall that stopped me in place. Every inch of it was covered in Polaroid photos, arranged in neat, careful rows. The photos were old, but not ancient. Some were faded, others looked almost new. I stepped closer, my flashlight shaking slightly as I tried to take them all in. Each photo showed a person standing in front of the farmhouse, right where I had entered. They were men and women, some young, some older. A few smiled, but most looked serious, maybe even nervous. Some of the photos were labeled on a bottom in black marker, listing dates that stretched back decades. None of them showed what happened after they walked inside. I moved along the wall, scanning the faces, feeling my stomach tighten. There were hundreds of them, maybe more. Some were grainy and faded, the colors bleeding away, but the newer ones were sharp, the subjects clear. The most recent photo made my breath catch. It was dated just 2 days ago. I kept going, and the hairs on my neck stood up when I saw an empty space on the wall. It wasn't just a gap, it was marked. A faint pencil outline shaped like a Polaroid with today's date written beneath it. My heart started pounding, a sick feeling crawling up from my gut. I turned to leave, but something moved behind me. A faint scuff against the stone floor. I swung the flashlight around, but the cellar was empty. The sound came again, softer this time, like footsteps trying not to be heard. I backed toward the stairs, keeping the light aimed ahead. Another sound came from above me. The faint creak of the floorboards in the kitchen. I forced myself up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, and pushed the cellar door open. The kitchen was empty, but I could feel something different in the air, heavier, closer. I crossed the room quickly, aiming for the front door. It was shut. I was sure I'd left it open, but now it was closed tight, and the knob wouldn't turn. I rattled it hard, feeling a sharp panic take over, then turned and ran for the back of the house. The back door was the same, locked, unmoving. Every window was nailed shut, boards covering the broken panes. I slammed my flashlight into one, trying to knock it loose, but the boards held fast. The sound echoed through the empty house like a warning. I could hear something moving above me now, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the upstairs floor. Then another sound, closer, a click, like the winding of an old camera. I froze, the flashlight beam shaking as I tried to pinpoint the noise. Another click, then a faint mechanical whir, like a photo sliding out. I stumbled back into the kitchen, looking around frantically. There was no one there, but I could hear breathing. Slow, steady, not my own. It was coming from the cellar stairs. I backed toward the front door again, pounding on it with both hands, shouting for help even though I knew no one was out there. The footsteps were on the stairs now, coming up from the cellar. Each creak of the wood sent a jolt through me. I fumbled with the front door again, fingers slipping on the knob. Then something cold brushed my neck, and I turned just as the flash went off. For a second, I couldn't see. The bright light burned into my eyes, leaving spots that made it hard to focus, but I could hear the click again, then the whir of another photo printing. I stumbled away blindly, hands out in front of me, but there was nowhere to go. When my vision cleared, I was back in the cellar. I don't remember moving there. I stood in front of the wall, the flashlight lying at my feet, flickering weakly. The photos were still there, still watching. And in the empty space I'd seen earlier, a new photo hung neatly pinned to the wall. It was me, standing in front of the house, smiling, though I couldn't remember smiling. The date beneath it was today. My legs felt weak, and I sank to the floor, too numb to move. Above me, the footsteps continued, pacing slowly from room to room, waiting for the next visitor. Story 2. The inn sat at the end of a long, winding road, half hidden by overgrown trees and thick brush. Its roof sagged under the weight of years, and the wooden sign out front was faded and cracked, the name impossible to read. I had passed it earlier that afternoon and felt an odd pull to stop. By the time dusk settled over the hills, curiosity got the better of me. I parked my car in what was once a gravel lot, now mostly dirt and weeds. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and earth, and silence pressed against me from every direction. I grabbed my backpack, switched on my flashlight, and approached the front door. It creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a dark foyer thick with dust. Inside, the floor groaned beneath my boots as I stepped carefully through the entrance. Old furniture was covered in white sheets stained yellow with age, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams like faded curtains. The air was still, almost suffocating, but there was no sign of animals or squatters. It felt strangely untouched. I made my way to what had once been the front desk. The guest book still lay open, though its pages were brittle and faded. The last entry was dated over 50 years ago. I ran my fingers over the names and dates scrawled in shaky handwriting, wondering who had last stayed here and why they had never come back. Upstairs, most of the doors were closed, but one room stood open at the end of the hall. It looked less decayed than the rest, as if someone had made an effort to keep it tidy. The bed was made, its blankets surprisingly clean, and the window shutters were intact, though no light came through. I decided this would be where I spent the night. After setting down my things, I checked the room carefully. The door locked from the inside with a sturdy bolt, and I slid it firmly into place. The windows were shut tight as well, their latches rusted but functional. I tested both twice, wanting to be sure. Once satisfied, I lay down on the bed and tried to relax. Sleep came slowly. The building shifted and creaked with age, each sound making my heart jump. At some point, exhaustion overtook my nerves and I drifted off. The dreams that followed were uneasy and fragmented, children laughing in the distance, small feet running down long, dark hallways, I kept hearing tapping sounds, light but constant, as though something was moving around the room. When I woke, it was still early, the light outside faint and gray. At first, everything seemed normal. The room was just as I had left it. But then I noticed the floor. Dozens of muddy footprints circled the bed. Small, child-sized prints, as if a group of kids had walked barefoot in the dirt and then padded silently around me as I slept. I sat up slowly, staring at the prints. They weren't random. They formed a circle, almost perfect, and the mud was still damp. My pulse hammered in my throat as I scanned the room again. The door was still bolted. The windows were still shut. There was no way anyone could have gotten in without me knowing. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, careful not to disturb the prints. The closer I looked, the more unsettling they became. Some were deep, as if the person had been standing there for a while. Others trailed off toward the far corner of the room but ended abruptly, with no exit point. There was no mud leading to the door or windows, just the prints circling the bed. My hand shook as I unbolted the door and stepped into the hall. It was empty, dust hanging heavy in the morning light. I checked the other rooms, pushing each door open with a growing sense of dread. They were all empty. No footprints in the dust, no signs of anyone else having been there. I made my way downstairs, half expecting to hear movement, but there was nothing. The silence was absolute. Even outside, there were no birds, no wind, just that suffocating stillness. I didn't waste time gathering my things. I grabbed my bag and made for the door. As I crossed the foyer, I glanced back one last time. On the far wall, scrawled in what looked like mud, was a message. The letters were uneven and shaky, but I could read them clearly. Stay another night. The words made my stomach twist, and I forced myself to look away. The front door resisted as I pulled it open, its hinges screaming in protest. I stumbled outside, gulping in the fresh air like it was the first I had breathed in hours. The sky was pale and colorless, the world around me feeling thin and hollow. I didn't look back as I got into the car. The tires skidded on the gravel as I pulled out of the lot, the wheels spitting loose stones. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but in the mirror, I thought I saw small shapes standing at the windows, watching me leave. I pressed harder on the gas, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly. Miles later, I finally slowed down. My pulse was still racing, but the sense of danger had faded. I pulled over and checked the locks on the doors out of habit, my fingers trembling. In the back seat, my backpack had shifted during the drive, spilling out a few of my things, and sitting neatly on top was a small, muddy handprint. I stared at it for a long time, my mouth dry and my thoughts racing. There was no way it should have been there. No way it could have followed me. I wiped it away with the sleeve of my jacket, but the stain lingered faintly beneath the fabric. That night, back home, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jump. Around 3 in the morning, I swore I heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Light, almost playful but slow. I stayed awake until dawn, listening, but nothing else happened. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about the message on the wall. Stay another night, as if the first one had only been a warning. Part of me wonders what would have happened if I had listened. Another part of me knows it's better I'll never find out. Story 3. The school had been closed for years. People said it was condemned, unsafe, dangerous to even step inside. But standing there that afternoon, the front doors hanging slightly open, I couldn't resist. Curiosity had pulled me to worse places, and this one was practically asking for someone to walk through. Inside, the smell of mildew and old books hung thick in the air. The floor creaked under every step, the sound echoing down the empty hallways. Rows of lockers stood open like silent mouths, their contents long since picked over or rotted away. I made my way slowly, pausing to glance into classrooms as I passed. Most of them were empty, chairs overturned, blackboards stained with time. In some, papers littered the floor, too faded to make out what they once said. I wandered further, deeper into the building, where the light from outside barely reached. That's when I noticed one door standing wide open, as if waiting for me. I stepped inside and immediately felt something shift. The air was colder, stiller, as if the room was holding its breath. The desks were all neatly lined up in rows, each one perfectly in place. It was too clean, too ordered for a place left to decay. Then I noticed the name tags. Each desk had one carefully placed on top, written in dark ink on yellowed paper. As I moved closer, my eyes caught the names, and a chill ran through me. Every single tag had the same last name. My last name. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Row after row, desk after desk, each tag different in the first name but ending with the same surname. Some names were familiar names of distant relatives, long-gone ancestors, but others were ones I didn't recognize. It was like a family reunion laid out in a classroom. I reached for the closest desk and brushed the dust off the tag. My fingers trembled as I read the name beneath. It was mine. First and last, clear as day. My heart started pounding in my ears and I quickly looked around, half expecting someone to be watching me. The windows were grimy, the light barely getting through. I could see my reflection in the glass, pale and tense, but no one else. The room remained silent except for the sound of my breathing, which had grown faster without me noticing. I took a step back, knocking into another desk behind me. The tag on that one slid to the edge and nearly fell off. I caught it just in time, holding it between my fingers. It was another name, another relative I thought I'd only ever seen mentioned in old letters. I stared at it until my vision blurred. Something wasn't right. I glanced toward the teacher's desk at the front of the room. There was a single folder resting on top, perfectly centered. I walked toward it, my footsteps unnervingly loud on the old floorboards. The folder was old but clean, the paper inside still crisp. Opening it, I found a list. A long handwritten list of names. My last name filled every line, first name scribbled in neat cursive. Dates were listed next to each one, some stretching back generations. My own name was there, along with today's date. The pen mark was fresh. I dropped the folder and stumbled back from the desk. Panic clawed at the edge of my thoughts, but I forced myself to stay focused. I had to get out of there. Turning toward the door, I froze when I saw it was no longer open. It was shut tight, as if it had never been open at all. My fingers scrambled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Lock, jammed, something I couldn't see was keeping it closed. The air grew heavier, as though the walls themselves were pushing inward. I turned back to the classroom and noticed something else. The desks were closer together than they had been before. The aisle I had walked through was now narrower. It was subtle, but undeniable. I hadn't imagined it. I backed away until I was pressed against the door, my hands flat against its cold surface. My pulse pounded in my throat as I watched the room. Then, as I stood there, I heard it. A faint scrape, like wood dragging against wood. One of the desks shifted forward an inch. The next desk moved soon after. Slowly, methodically, the entire room seemed to close in, inch by inch. The name tags sat untouched, but the desks carrying them were closing in around me. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one answered. Only my voice filled the room, bouncing back at me from the empty walls. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked for another way out. The windows were too high and too narrow. The walls were solid, no gaps or vents to crawl through. The only thing left was the teacher's desk. I ran for it, pushing past the rows of closing desks. I yanked open the drawers, searching for anything that could help. In the bottom drawer, there was a single key. My fingers closed around it, and I bolted back to the door. The key slid into the lock and turned with a reluctant click. The door creaked open just enough for me to squeeze through. I didn't stop running until I was out of the building and back in the daylight. My chest burned with every breath, my legs shaking with each step. I didn't look back, not even once, as I made my way to my car. Only when I was inside and the engine was running did I allow myself to think. The building still stood there, quiet and still, as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. There was a reason that classroom existed, a reason all those names were written down. And now mine was part of that list. Story 4. The ranger station had been empty for years, or at least that's what I'd been told. Its roof sagged in places, and the paint on its wooden siding had long since peeled away, leaving gray slats exposed to the elements. It was tucked back in the forest about a mile from where I set up my tent, and curiosity got the better of me just before sunset. I figured I'd take a quick look around, maybe snap a few pictures, and be back at camp before it got dark. The place had an uneasy stillness as I approached, like it was holding its breath. The front door hung open at an angle, the hinges warped and rusted. Inside, the air smelled damp and stale, like mold and something faintly metallic. I stepped inside, careful where I placed my feet, since the floorboards creaked loud enough to make me wince. The main room still had some of its old furniture, 2 chairs overturned near a cold wood stove and a desk with a few scattered papers on it. A thick layer of dust coated everything, disturbed only by what looked like recent footprints. I wasn't sure if they were old boots or animal tracks, but either way it made my skin crawl. I moved through the room slowly, checking behind doors and peeking into the cabinets, not expecting to find anything interesting. Then I found a narrow staircase in the back hallway leading down into the basement. It was dark, and the faint smell of damp concrete wafted up toward me. I hesitated, shining my flashlight down into the blackness, but something made me keep going. The steps groaned under my weight as I descended, and the temperature dropped noticeably the further I went. At the bottom was a large, open room with concrete walls and no windows. A single table sat in the middle with a lamp still plugged into the wall. To my surprise, when I hit the switch, it flickered on, bathing the space in pale, yellow light. Spread across the table were several large maps, each marked with thick red lines tracing the trails and backroads of the surrounding forest. Some had symbols drawn next to them, circles, triangles, X's, Eds, and they were labeled with neat handwriting in black marker. As I leaned closer, I started reading the notations written beside the trails. Harvest successful. Target acquired. Return incomplete. Each phrase was followed by a date, and the more I looked, the more recent they became. Some of them were from just weeks ago. I followed the red lines with my finger, realizing they formed a wide grid that covered dozens of miles around the ranger station. In the corner of one map, a trail was circled with today's date written underneath. I recognized it immediately. It was the same trail I had hiked earlier that afternoon, the same one that led back to my campsite. My stomach twisted at the thought. This wasn't old or forgotten. Someone had marked that trail for today, and I was standing here, reading it like I wasn't already part of whatever plan was unfolding. I took a step back from the table, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. Too quiet. The only sound was my own breathing and the low hum of the flickering lamp. I scanned the room quickly and saw filing cabinets along the wall. They were dented and rusted, but one drawer was slightly open, as if someone had been there recently. Inside were folders labeled with numbers and names, some handwritten, others typed neatly. I pulled one out and opened it. Inside were photographs of people, men, women, even a few kids. Each photo was stapled to a form listing details like age, height, weight, and last known location. Some of the forms had a single word stamped in red across the top: processed. I put the folder down and moved to the next cabinet. This one contained audio tapes, each labeled with a date and what I assumed were the initials of whoever made the recording. A small player sat on top of the cabinet, and without thinking, I pressed play on the first tape I found. The sound of footsteps crackled through the speakers, followed by a low voice. "Approaching target," it said. "No signs of resistance. Commencing extraction." I hit stop and stepped away, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't some old ranger station. It was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with nature or conservation. I thought about the trail marked for today and realized I needed to get out of there. Fast. I turned off the lamp and climbed the stairs as quietly as I could. The main room was darker now, the last of the daylight fading through the broken windows. I slipped outside and kept low, listening for any sound that wasn't mine. In the distance, I thought I heard the faint crack of a branch breaking underfoot. I moved quickly through the trees, avoiding the trail I'd taken earlier. I didn't know who was out there, but I wasn't about to make it easy for them. My mind kept replaying the words I'd read on the maps: target acquired, harvest successful. What did that even mean? I didn't want to find out. It took longer than it should have to reach my camp, and by the time I did, it was almost completely dark. My gear was exactly where I'd left it, but everything felt different now. Exposed. Vulnerable. I grabbed my pack and started breaking camp in record time, stuffing everything into my bag without caring how neatly it fit. I didn't take the trail back toward my car. Instead, I cut through the forest, using my compass in the moonlight to guide me in what I hoped was the right direction. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow felt too close. More than once I thought I saw movement behind me, just far enough away that I couldn't be sure. When I finally saw the faint glimmer of my car through the trees, I nearly collapsed from relief. I ran the last stretch, fumbled the keys, and forced myself not to look back as I climbed in and locked the doors. The engine coughed before turning over, and the headlights lit up the forest road in front of me. I drove until I hit the highway, not stopping until I was miles away. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone there, following me. I don't camp anymore. I don't hike much either. But sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed at that campsite just a little longer. Story 5. The asylum loomed in the distance as I climbed over the rusted gate. It had been closed for decades, its windows shattered and its walls stained by time. The stories about it were enough to keep most people away. But I wasn't most people. I had always been drawn to places like this, forgotten, crumbling and heavy with silence. The main entrance was sealed, so I circled the building until I found a broken window. The glass was jagged, but I managed to squeeze through without cutting myself. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mold. My flashlight's beam shook slightly as I moved it across the peeling walls and torn furniture. I started down the first hallway, my boots echoing on the tile floor. Wheelchairs sat abandoned in corners, their wheels frozen with rust. Names were scratched into the paint on the walls, some deep enough to expose the brick underneath. I kept moving, trying not to focus on how cold it had become in such a short time. Each door I passed hung open or was splintered from age and neglect. The rooms behind them were mostly empty, but every so often I'd find something that made me pause: a child's shoe, a cracked doll's head, a single crutch leaning against a wall. I kept telling myself these were leftovers from a different time, but the unease in my chest was growing heavier with every step. Eventually, I found a staircase that led to the second floor. It groaned under my weight as I climbed, but it held. At the top was a long corridor that curved gently out of sight. There were fewer rooms here, and most of the doors were shut tight. One of them, near the end of the hall, stood half open. Light from my flashlight caught the number on it: -217. I pushed the door slowly and stepped inside. The room was cleaner than I expected, as if someone had been there recently. A table stood against the wall, and on it was a thick, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth, but it had no title. I walked over and opened it, brushing away the thin layer of dust. The first page had a date that matched today. I felt my stomach twist as I read the first few lines. It described someone entering the asylum through a window on the west side. It mentioned the black hoodie I was wearing, my jeans, and the old boots I had laced up that morning. It even noted the time I had arrived down to the minute. I flipped through more pages, and the descriptions continued in unsettling detail. It mentioned how I hesitated at certain doors, how I touched the scratches on the walls as I passed. There were words about my breathing quickening, my hands shaking as I climbed the stairs. I didn't know how any of this was possible. I was alone. I had been sure of it. Near the back of the journal, the entries grew stranger. The handwriting became messier, and there were sketches in the margins, twisted shapes that barely resembled human figures. One page described how I had entered room 217 and picked up the journal. The next line said I wouldn't leave. I backed away from the table, my flashlight flickering. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were inching closer. I turned toward the door, but something caught my eye. On the far wall was a mirror, cracked but intact. In its reflection, I saw the hallway beyond the doorway, but there was something else. A figure stood there, just outside the room, watching. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew it saw me. I spun around with the flashlight, but the hall was empty. My heart pounded as I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, closer now. I grabbed the journal without thinking and ran. The hallway seemed longer than it had before. My footsteps echoed too loudly, and every doorway I passed felt like an open mouth waiting to close around me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. At the stairs, I nearly slipped on the dust and debris, but managed to stay upright. I took the steps 2 at a time, my legs burning as I hit the first floor. The main hallway stretched out in front of me, darker than before. It felt like the shadows were thicker, heavier. I found the window I had come through and hurried toward it. When I reached it, I saw something that made me stop. The broken glass was gone. The window was whole, sealed shut, as if it had never been broken in the first place. I banged on it with my fists, but it didn't give. Turning away from the window, I tried to think. There had to be another way out. I remembered seeing a service tunnel mentioned in the asylum's old blueprints, but I hadn't found it yet. I moved back into the hallway, following my flashlight beam toward the lower levels. A stairwell at the far end of the building led down into the basement. The air grew colder with each step. The smell of damp earth and rust was stronger here. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water that echoed through the narrow corridors. I finally found a metal door with a faded sign that read Service Access. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing me to crouch. As I made my way forward, I heard something scraping behind me. I didn't look back. I kept crawling until the tunnel opened up into a maintenance room. There was a door at the far end, but it was chained shut from the outside. I turned to find another way and saw the journal lying on the floor in front of me, open to a new page. This entry was written in fresh ink. It said I had reached the maintenance room and was reading the latest entry. It said I was about to hear breathing behind me, and then I did. The sound was low and steady, close enough that I could feel the air move. My skin crawled as I slowly turned my head. In the shadows behind me, two pale hands were reaching out, fingers curled and twitching. I scrambled for the door, pulling at the chain, but it wouldn't budge. I screamed until my throat felt raw, the sound swallowed by the cold stone walls. The last thing I saw was the journal's final line, scrawled in jagged letters. Caught. Story 6. The barn sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, hidden behind overgrown fields and half-dead trees. I had heard the stories for years. Everyone in town knew about the old place. They said it was haunted, cursed, that anyone who went inside came back different. Some never came back at all. I never believed much in those things, but something about the place had always stuck in my mind. I parked my truck at the edge of the property and walked the rest of the way. The air was thick and still, as if everything nearby was holding its breath. Grass brushed against my legs as I pushed through the tall weeds, the barn looming larger with every step. Its wood was weathered gray, boards sagging and warped, yet it stood solid against the sky. The front doors hung open slightly, creaking when I gave them a push. Inside, dust floated in thick beams of light, filtering down from gaps in the roof. The place smelled old rotted wood, mold, and something faintly metallic underneath it all. I stepped inside slowly, my boots echoing on the rough wooden floor. The lower level was empty, except for a few broken tools and rusted-out farm equipment. Wheels with missing spokes leaned against the walls, and a pile of cracked boards sat in one corner. I saw old hoof prints in the dirt, but no sign of any living animals. Everything was still, and the silence pressed hard against my ears. I found the ladder to the hayloft near the back wall. The rungs groaned under my weight that they held. I climbed slowly, feeling the air grow colder the higher I went. When I pulled myself up into the loft, I froze where I stood. Several nooses hung from the rafters, each one swaying ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. The ropes were old but sturdy, thick and rough. Each loop was tied with care, hanging at different heights as if waiting for someone to stand beneath them. There was a message painted on the far wall in wide, uneven letters. It was red, smeared in places, but I could still read it clear as day. One for each visitor. I stood there, staring at the words, feeling my mouth go dry. There were 6 nooses in total, each spaced far enough apart that a person could stand between them without touching the others. I counted them again, just to be sure. 6. I was alone in the barn, or at least I thought I was. I turned slowly, scanning the space around me. The loft was mostly empty, just old hay scattered across the floor in brittle clumps. But then I saw something else. Scratches in the wood, long gouges that dug deep into the beams near the walls. Some looked fresh, as if whatever had made them had done so recently. I took a cautious step forward, moving closer to the scratches. My foot struck something solid hidden in the hay. I knelt and pushed the straw aside, revealing an old boot. The leather was cracked and faded, but what made my stomach twist was the fact that the boot still had a foot in it. Bone poked through the torn fabric of old jeans, and I realized there was more buried beneath the hay. I stumbled back, breathing hard, wiping my hands on my jeans though they were already covered in dust. I looked at the nooses again. 6 of them. My mind started working through the math, how many had come before me, how many were still here. I thought about the rumors, the people who never came back. Maybe they hadn't left. Maybe they were all still hanging here, in pieces. I thought I heard something above me then, a soft scraping sound from the rafters. I looked up and saw nothing at first, just the old wooden beams crisscrossing high overhead. But as I stared, my eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I noticed something darker against the wood. Shapes crouched and still, like animals waiting to spring. I backed toward the ladder, careful not to make too much noise. But the moment I moved, something else did too. A shift in the air, a low creak as something heavy pressed against the boards. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and scrambled for the ladder, my hands slick with sweat, my breath ragged in my throat. I made it to the bottom, jumping the last few feet and landing hard enough to jolt my knees. I stumbled but didn't stop, heading for the open doors. Behind me I heard the nooses creak and sway, their ropes groaning like old trees in the wind. Only there wasn't any wind, just the sound of something moving through the hayloft, coming closer. Outside, the light was failing fast. The sky had turned a dull gray, and the trees seemed to lean inward, closing off the path I'd taken in. I ran through the weeds, ignoring the cuts they left on my arms. My truck was just ahead, but it felt like miles away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what might be following me. I made it to the truck, yanked the door open, and climbed inside. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice, then caught. I threw it into gear and backed up fast, tearing through the grass and onto the dirt road. Only then did I risk a glance in the mirror. The barn was still there, dark and quiet against the fading sky. But I thought I saw something on the roof, a figure watching from the peak. It didn't move, and I told myself it was just a shadow, just my imagination. But deep down I knew better. I didn't go back to that barn. I didn't talk about what I found there either, at least not for a long time. But sometimes late at night I think about the sign painted in red, one for each visitor. And I wonder if they ever add more nooses or if they just wait for the next person to show up. Story 7. I wasn't planning to stay the night. The trail I was on wasn't on any map I owned. But I'd followed it out of curiosity, ignoring how quickly it seemed to narrow and disappear under the weight of fallen leaves and time. I'd hiked deeper than I meant to, and by the time I realized how late it had gotten, the sun was already sinking low behind the trees. That's when I saw an old hunting cabin sitting just off the trail, its roof slouched and walls weathered gray. I circled it once, listening. The woods were quiet in that thick way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. No birds. No wind. Still, the cabin looked solid enough from the outside, and night was coming fast. The door creaked when I pushed it open, but it gave easily, and the interior was dry, even if it smelled faintly of old wood smoke and damp leaves. There was one room. A narrow cot rested against the far wall, a small wood stove beside it. Dust hung in the light from the doorway. Across from the stove was a wooden table, worn smooth in the center like it had seen years of use. On top of that table was something I didn't expect to see: knives. A series of them lined up neatly by size, each one gleaming in the fading light. There were 7 of them. The largest was more like a cleaver, thick and heavy, its handle wrapped in dark leather. They stepped down in size until the smallest one, a slender blade not much longer than my finger. I stepped closer, not sure why I was holding my breath, until I saw it. Etched into the wooden handle of the smallest knife was my name. Not just carved carelessly, but etched deep and precise. My first thought was that it couldn't be my name. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe I was reading it wrong in the strange light. But when I ran my thumb across the carved letters, there was no mistake. It was my name. I jerked my hand back and stared around the room like I'd missed something, like maybe someone was watching me right now, laughing from some hidden place. The cabin was empty. Dust on the floor, cobwebs in the corners, no fresh footprints but my own. I walked back to the door and stepped outside, looking around at the thick forest. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I thought about leaving, walking back the way I came, even if it meant hiking in the dark. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I could find the trail again. Reluctantly, I stepped back inside and shut the door behind me. The lock was old but still worked, and I slid the heavy bolt into place. It made me feel only a little better. I avoided the table with the knives, setting up my sleeping bag on the cot instead. I kept my flashlight close and my pocket knife even closer, although it felt useless compared to what was laid out on the table. Night in that cabin was different from anything I'd experienced before. I'd camped alone plenty of times, but there was something about this place that made me feel watched, even when I knew I was alone. Every creak of the old wood sounded too deliberate. Every snap of a twig outside made me flinch. I kept telling myself the knives were just strange coincidence. Someone with the same name. A sick joke. Anything but what it felt like. I didn't sleep much. I must have drifted off for a few minutes at a time, but I'd wake up every time the wind changed or I imagined I heard breathing that wasn't mine. Around midnight, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl, a slow scrape, metal on wood. I sat up fast, fumbling for my flashlight. I swept the beam toward the table. The knives hadn't moved. They sat there perfectly lined up, my name still etched into the smallest handle. I stared at them for a long time, waiting, but nothing else happened. I thought about taking the knife with my name on it, just so it wouldn't be left behind. But some part of me told me not to touch it again. It already felt like too much. When dawn came, I didn't wait. I packed my things quickly and unbolted the door. Outside, the forest was gray and silent, but at least the light was back. I didn't look back at the cabin. I just started walking, hoping to retrace my steps and find the trail that had led me there. After an hour of hiking, I finally saw a marker I'd recognized, and relief hit me so hard I laughed out loud. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept thinking about those knives lined up so carefully, about how someone had carved my name with steady hands, waiting for me to find it. I told myself it didn't matter. I was out of there. The woods were behind me, and I would never go back. Weeks passed before I told anyone. I mentioned it to a friend who hiked more than I did. He got quiet when I described the cabin. Said there used to be hunting lodges in those woods, but they'd all been abandoned for decades. He didn't know anything about knives or names, but he said I was lucky I got out. That made me wonder how many people hadn't. Even now, sometimes when I'm alone, I think about that small knife. How carefully my name had been carved. I wonder if it's still sitting there waiting for someone else to find it. Or maybe someone took it. Maybe someone's carrying it now. Story 8. The desert stretched on for miles in every direction, the kind of empty that makes you question how long you've been driving. I'd left the highway an hour ago, following a narrow dirt road that wasn't on any map I owned. I told myself I was just looking for a quiet place to camp for the night, but something about the isolation had started to make me uneasy. I was about to turn back when I spotted the RV. It was parked off to the side of the dirt track, half sunken into the soft sand like it had been sitting there for years. The paint was faded and peeling, and all the windows were covered in a thick layer of grime. At first I thought it was abandoned junk, nothing more than a forgotten shell in the middle of nowhere. But something about it made me stop the car and get out. I walked around it slowly, brushing my hand against the rough metal side as I passed. There was no sound except for the wind, and even that seemed muted. The door hung slightly open, creaking as it shifted in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air was stale and thick, the kind of smell that clings to old places left too long in the heat. The interior was stripped down to its basics. The seats were torn, the floor was covered in dust, and most of the cabinet doors hung open or broken. It wasn't until I reached the back of the RV that I saw the table. It was bolted to the floor, the kind you'd expect in an old motorhome, but the surface was covered in something that didn't belong. License plates. Dozens of them, maybe more. They were neatly arranged, side by side, each one cleaned and polished until they shone in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. I stepped closer, squinting at the plates. They were from all over different states, different years. Some were rusted at the edges. Others looked brand new. There was a pattern to the way they were laid out, but I couldn't make sense of it at first. Then I saw one that stopped me cold. It was my license plate. The same numbers, the same letters, the same small sticker in the corner. But the date on it wasn't from years ago. It was marked with last week's date. My stomach twisted as I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to vanish when my fingers brushed the metal. It was real, cold and solid under my hand. I backed away from the table, heart pounding in my chest. I'd driven my car out here myself. The plate was still on it, I was sure of it. I rushed to the door of the RV and jumped down to the sand, running back to where I had parked. My car was there, just as I had left it, but I crouched by the back bumper anyway. The plate was still attached, screwed in tight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the one on the table was just as real. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the emptiness around me, half expecting someone to step out from behind the RV or the nearest boulder. But no one did. And after a few minutes, I made myself go back inside. I needed to understand what I had found. I studied the other plates more carefully now. Some were old from decades ago, some were recent like mine. A few had marks scratched into them, small notches along the edges, numbers carved into the corners. I didn't know what they meant. I found a drawer under the table and opened it. Inside were several faded photographs, each one showing a car parked in different locations. Desert roads, rest stops, forest trails. The cars were all different makes and models, but one thing was the same in every picture. The license plates. They matched the ones on the table. I flipped through the photos with shaking hands, my mind racing. Were these trophies? Some kind of twisted collection? Or something worse? I stopped when I reached the last photo. It was a picture of my car, parked exactly where it was now, on the side of this dirt track. The sky in the picture was the same pale blue as it was above me. I turned quickly, half expecting someone to be standing behind me with a camera. But the RV was empty, just dust and silence. I grabbed the photos and stuffed them into my pocket. I didn't know why, but I felt like I needed to take them with me. I left the RV and got back in my car, locking the doors and starting the engine with hands that trembled. The road was rough on the way back, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Nothing followed me. No dust clouds on the horizon, no headlights, nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally made it back to the highway, I pulled over and checked the back of my car again. The plate was still there. Everything looked normal. But I couldn't stop thinking about that photo, about how someone had been close enough to take it without me ever knowing. I thought about going to the police. But what would I say? That I found an old RV full of license plates in the middle of nowhere. That someone had photographed my car and left a copy of my plate inside. It sounded crazy even to me. That night, I parked my car in a motel parking lot under a bright streetlight. I kept the curtains closed tight and the door locked. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that table in the RV again, those plates gleaming in the dim light. And I saw my own plate, dated last week, sitting there like it was waiting for me. In the morning, I checked my car one more time. Nothing had changed. But I still couldn't bring myself to drive home. I kept thinking about those other photos, those other cars, wondering what happened to them, or wondering if their drivers had ever made it back. Story 9. The old watchtower stood crooked at the edge of the woods, its outline sharp against the fading sky. I had seen it from the trail earlier and decided to take a closer look before it got completely dark. The place looked forgotten, the wooden stairs worn but still holding steady as I climbed them. Each step creaked beneath my boots, the sound echoing hollow in the stillness. At the top, the door hung slightly open. I gave it a push, and it swung inward with a groan. The room smelled of dust and old wood, but there was no hint of decay beyond that. The light filtering through the grime-smeared windows was thin, but I could make out the rough shape of a table, a chair, and a telescope aimed through one of the windows. The telescope was large, old-fashioned but clean, and carefully positioned. I stepped closer and leaned down to look through it, expecting maybe a view of the horizon or the tops of the trees. Instead, my car filled the circular lens, parked alone at the edge of the lot far below. It was centered perfectly, as if whoever had been here last had spent a lot of time making sure it was aimed just right. Next to the telescope, on the battered wooden table, sat a notebook. It was open to a page that had only 3 words written in block letters. Watched all night. The handwriting was neat, almost too neat, and I found myself reading it again, slower this time. My fingers rested lightly on the paper, feeling the faint indentation of the pen marks beneath my skin. I glanced over my shoulder, but the tower was empty. I hadn't seen another car in the lot, and I'd passed no one on the trail coming up. Still, the feeling of being observed crawled over me like a cold draft. I turned back toward the telescope and slowly adjusted it, swinging it to the left, then the right, to see if anything else stood out in the woods below. The trees seemed normal, dark shapes swaying slightly in the breeze. But I kept thinking about how precisely it had been pointed. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they were still nearby. I rubbed my arms, feeling the chill creep deeper as dusk gave way to night. It was time to leave. I closed the notebook and tucked it under my arm. Part of me thought it was a stupid thing to take, but another part of me wasn't ready to leave it behind. On my way back down the stairs, I kept pausing, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Branches snapping. Footsteps behind me. There was nothing, just the quiet creak of the tower shifting with the wind. At the bottom, I hesitated again. My car sat just where I'd left it, nothing seemed different, but I still felt uneasy. I made my way across the open ground quickly, glancing up at the tower window as I went. No one was there, or at least no one I could see. Inside the car, I locked the doors out of habit and sat for a moment staring up at the tower. The last light was fading, and soon it was just a black shape against the darkening sky. I opened the notebook again, flipping through the earlier pages. Most were blank, but a few had dates scrawled in the same blocky handwriting. Some had times next to them, others just the same phrase repeated, watched all night. One page listed a description of a car that wasn't mine, down to the license plate. Below it, a simple line read, "Arrived, left at dawn." Another page had what looked like notes about someone hiking in from the South Trail. Camped near the creek, left supplies behind. I put the notebook on the passenger seat and started the engine. The sound broke the stillness like a crack, and I found myself checking the mirrors too many times as I drove away from the lot. The forest loomed closer to the road than I remembered, and every shadow looked too deep, too still. By the time I made it back to town, the feeling hadn't left. I parked under a streetlight in front of my apartment building and sat there for a while, staring at the notebook. It was just paper and ink, but it felt heavier than that. Finally, I took it inside and flipped on every light in the place before sitting at my kitchen table to read more carefully. There were more notes deeper in the book, names I didn't recognize, descriptions of clothing, lists of equipment people had with them. Some of the entries were crossed out, others underlined. On the last page, scrawled across the bottom, was a line that made my chest tighten. Black sedan, parked under streetlight, lights on in apartment, watched all night. I slammed the book shut and went to the window. There was a black car parked across the street. I couldn't see anyone inside, but it was there, just like the notebook said. The streetlight flickered above it, and I backed away from the window slowly. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined footsteps coming up the stairs outside my door. When morning came, the car was gone. The notebook was still on my table, but I couldn't bring myself to open it again. I thought about burning it, throwing it away, anything to get rid of it. But I didn't. Part of me wanted to know who had written it and why they'd been watching people from that tower. A few days later, I drove back out to the trailhead. There were no other cars again, no sign that anyone had been there since me. But I didn't climb the tower. I just stood there staring up at it, wondering if someone was already watching me from above. When I finally left, I kept looking in the mirrors. I didn't see a black car that time, but I knew better than to think it was over. That night, I left the notebook in my trunk, locked inside. The next morning, when I went to check on it, it was gone. In its place was a single page folded neatly. Watched all night, written in the same block letters. Underneath, the time was listed. Midnight. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't go driving alone to quiet places. I keep all my windows covered and my doors locked. But sometimes, late at night, I still see the red glow of brake lights sitting outside, waiting, watching. Story 10. I had passed the old factory dozens of times before I finally decided to go inside. The building sat at the edge of town, surrounded by cracked pavement and overgrown weeds. Its windows were grimy and half broken, and the faded sign above the entrance still faintly read Wren Company Mannequin Factory. Curiosity got the better of me one afternoon, so I parked nearby and made my way toward the front doors. The inside smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly sour. My footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as I walked through the front hall. Rusted machinery lined the walls, their gears seized up long ago. Bits of plastic limbs and shattered molds lay scattered on the ground, giving the place an eerie, broken feel. I passed through the main factory floor, where rows of headless mannequins stood waiting in crooked lines. Their blank torsos and stiff hands looked pale in the dim light filtering through the dusty windows. Some of them leaned at strange angles, as if they had been pushed and never stood up again. The farther I walked, the quieter everything became, like the building was swallowing every sound. Toward the back of the factory, I found a door that had been left slightly open. A small plaque next to it said Production Room 3. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside, the smell changing instantly. It was sharper here, like old chemicals and something else I couldn't quite place. Rows of mannequins stood in the room, more detailed than the ones out front. They all had heads, faces sculpted with delicate precision, and glass eyes that seemed to glimmer faintly in the dimness. I moved closer to one and noticed its teeth, At first, I thought they were just well-crafted better than usual for a mannequin. But as I leaned in, I realized they were real. Each tooth was unique, with tiny imperfections and staining that plastic wouldn't have. The gums had been painted in a way that made them look disturbingly lifelike. I stepped back, feeling my stomach twist. Looking around the room, I saw that all the mannequins had similar teeth. Rows of them smiled faintly with unsettling accuracy. Some mouths were slightly open, and I could even see molars in the back. I touched one of their faces and the skin was cold and hard, but whoever painted them had added small veins at the temples. The attention to detail was too good. It felt wrong. In the far corner, I spotted one mannequin that was different from the others. Its head was tilted slightly, and it had a full head of hair. As I approached, I noticed how natural the hair looked. The strands weren't synthetic, they had different textures and shades, like real human hair. I reached out and ran my fingers through it. It was soft and warm, as if it still held the heat from a person's scalp. A chill ran through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly. I took a step around to look at its face more closely. Its eyes didn't match. One was the usual painted glass, but the other was glossy and had a depth that was hard to describe. It reminded me of looking into someone's living eye right before they blinked. But this one didn't blink. Behind the mannequin, I noticed a small metal table with tools laid out on it. Scalpels, pliers, and what looked like a dental drill. They were old, but clean. Next to them sat a wooden tray lined with teeth. Each one was tagged with a small slip of paper, marked with dates and numbers. Some of them still had fragments of dried root attached. My mouth went dry as I stared down at them. I backed away from the table, my legs feeling weak. As I turned to leave, something shifted in the room. The air felt thicker, like someone had just stepped in behind me. But when I turned around, nothing had moved. The mannequins all stood exactly as they had before, silent and still. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I hurried toward the door, but stopped when I saw a notebook sitting on a chair just to the side of the doorway. Its leather cover was cracked and stained, but it was open to a page with neat handwriting. It listed names, each followed by a date and a note about donation or extraction. Some of the names had red lines through them. Others were circled. Near the bottom of the list was a name I recognized. It was mine, spelled perfectly. I froze, staring at it for a few seconds before slamming the book shut. My pulse was racing as I glanced back toward the mannequins. They hadn't moved, but the room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. I bolted for the hallway, my footsteps pounding louder now as I ran back through the factory floor. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold air. The silence of the factory hung behind me like a shadow. I glanced back at the doorway. Nothing followed, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something was watching me from one of those dusty windows. I got in my car and drove away fast, not caring about the potholes in the road or the low scrape of my tires against broken asphalt. Even as I reached the edge of town, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those pale faces staring back at me from the back seat. That night I dreamed of teeth. They filled my hands, spilling from my pockets, crunching under my shoes. I woke up with the taste of iron in my mouth and a deep ache in my jaw. When I looked in the mirror, my gums were sore, as if something had been pulling at them while I slept. I haven't gone back to the factory. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes when I'm in a crowd, I catch sight of someone with a smile that's too wide or hair that looks just a little too familiar. And when they turn toward me, their eyes are flat and glassy, as if they were never alive to begin with. Story 11. It was already past dark when I pulled off the highway. The long drive had worn me down, and the nearest town was still hours away. I spotted a flickering neon sign that read vacancy in front of a small, single-story roadside motel. With nowhere else to go, I turned into the lot and parked. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. There were a few cars scattered in front of some of the rooms, but I didn't see anyone. The lobby was empty when I walked in, save for an old desk with a tarnished brass bell. After ringing it twice, a tired-looking man appeared from a back office and slid a key toward me without saying much. I didn't ask questions. The rate was cheap, and I was exhausted. "Room 6, he said, "just down the row on the left." I carried my bag across the cracked pavement, hearing only the sound of my footsteps and the hum of the buzzing light above each door. When I found the room, I unlocked it and stepped inside. The room wasn't anything special. A queen bed with stiff-looking sheets, a wooden dresser, and a small TV bolted to the wall. The carpet had a faint, musty smell, and the air conditioner rattled loudly when I turned it on. I tossed my bag on the bed and headed straight for the bathroom to wash up. That's when I noticed something odd about the mirror above the sink. The glass was too clear, too perfect, with an unnatural gleam that caught my eye. I tapped on it. It gave off a dull, hollow sound. I'd seen enough crime shows to recognize a two-way mirror when I was standing in front of one. I stood there for a few moments, staring at my reflection. Then curiosity pushed me to investigate further. I checked the edges of the mirror and found a small gap near the bottom corner. There was just enough space to wedge my fingers in and pull. With a little force, the mirror swung open like a door. Behind it was a dark, narrow room. I shone the flashlight on my phone inside and felt my stomach twist. Directly opposite the mirror was a metal chair bolted to the concrete floor. The chair had thick leather restraints on the arms and legs, cracked with age but still intact. There was a faint rust-colored stain beneath it. I backed away, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't just the chair or the mirror, it was the fact that it had clearly been used for something I didn't want to think about. I shut the mirror door and stepped away from the sink. For a moment, I considered going straight to the front desk and demanding answers. But something told me that was a bad idea. Instead, I grabbed my bag, checked that my car keys were still inside, and made sure the door was locked behind me. I sat on the bed for a few minutes, staring at the door and listening. Every creak of the building made me jump. I kept glancing at the bathroom, expecting someone to step out from behind that mirror. I finally decided to leave. I didn't care if it was late, and I didn't care if I was tired. I wasn't going to stay in that room a second longer. But when I unbolted the door and opened it, the man from the front desk was standing there. His face was blank, his eyes dark and empty. "You heading out already?" he asked in a flat voice. He took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "Something came up. I've got to get back on the road." He didn't move for a second, then nodded slowly. "Shame, you just got here." His eyes flicked toward the bathroom door. "Room all right?" "It's fine," I lied, "just in a hurry." I edged past him, keeping my eyes on his hands. He didn't try to stop me, but he stood there in the doorway, watching as I walked quickly to my car. I fumbled with the keys but managed to unlock the door and start the engine. As I backed out of the lot, I saw the man still standing there. A faint smile pulled at his mouth, but there was nothing friendly about it. I didn't stop driving until I was well down the highway, and even then, I kept checking my mirrors. I stopped at a gas station about an hour later to clear my head. I sat in the car for a while, thinking about what I had seen. The two-way mirror. the chair, the restraints, and the man who clearly knew I had found them. I wondered how many people had stayed in that room before me, how many had noticed the mirror, how many never made it back to their cars. I thought about calling the police, but I realized I hadn't seen a name on the motel's sign. No address, no phone number. I wasn't even sure I could find my way back if I tried. The exit I had taken wasn't marked, and the road signs had been old and unreadable. It was like the place had vanished the second I drove away. That night, I stayed in a crowded rest stop parking lot, sleeping in my car with the doors locked and a pocket knife on the seat beside me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chair in that dark room. I imagined hearing footsteps on the gravel outside my window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. In the morning, I got back on the highway and drove without stopping for hours. Part of me thought about warning others, but how do you warn someone about a place that might not even exist on a map? I told myself it was over, that I was safe, but deep down I wasn't sure. Sometimes when I check into a motel, I tap on the mirrors just to be certain. I look for odd gaps or signs that something isn't right. So far, I haven't found anything like that room again. But I still think about the man at the door, about the way he smiled, like he was waiting for me to stay just a little longer. Story 12. The church had been abandoned for years, its once white steeple now dark with rot and moss. Windows were broken, stained glass lying in colorful shards across the cracked stone steps. The front doors hung unevenly on their rusted hinges, creaking softly whenever the wind passed through. Still, something about the place made me stop, staring longer than I should have before finally deciding to step inside. The air was cold and damp, smelling of mildew and something older, something sour beneath the decay. My footsteps echoed faintly as I moved through the nave, the pews covered in a thick layer of dust. Faded hymnals were scattered across the floor, their pages bloated and curling from moisture. I walked slowly toward the pulpit, where sunlight struggled through broken windows to reach the altar. Behind the altar, there was a door. It was partially open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. I hesitated at the top step, listening, but all I heard was the steady drip of water from somewhere below. Gripping my flashlight tighter, I started down, each wooden step groaning beneath my weight. The air grew colder as I descended, and by the time I reached the bottom, my breath was clouding in front of me. The flashlight beam swept across damp stone walls and a low ceiling, and then it found water. The basement was flooded, murky water lapping softly against the steps. It smelled foul, like something had been left to rot for a very long time. I stepped carefully into the water. It was ice cold, soaking through my boots instantly. The beam of my flashlight flickered as I moved further in, illuminating floating debris. At first, I thought they were just old books, ruined by water and mold. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't books at all. They were photo albums. Dozens of them drifted silently in the water, their covers bloated and soft to the touch. Some were cracked open, pages half submerged, revealing photographs inside. I picked one up and carefully opened it, water dripping from its edges. The photos were of a family smiling parents with 2 children at parks, birthday parties, family gatherings. Their faces were blurred and distorted by water damage, but something about them seemed familiar. I opened another album and then another. More photos, different people. Some were formal portraits, others casual snapshots. All of them had a strange sameness, like they had all come from the same small town. After flipping through several pages, I noticed something else. Many of these people were ones I had seen before, but not in photos like this. I had seen them on missing person posters around town. The realization sank in slowly, like the cold water I was standing in. I ran my fingers along the spines of the albums floating nearby. Each one had names written neatly on the covers, some I recognized immediately. I remembered those names from news reports, candlelight vigils, and the flyers that had once papered telephone poles and storefront windows. My stomach twisted as I turned back toward the stairs, but something made me hesitate. I noticed a larger album floating just beneath the surface, its dark cover almost invisible in the gloom. I pulled it free from the water and wiped away the slime. There was no name on the front, just an old, rusted clasp that opened with a soft snap. Inside were photographs, but these were different. They weren't posed or smiling. They looked candid, almost like surveillance photos. People caught walking down the street, leaving their homes, getting into their cars. Some of them looked startled, as if they'd heard something just before the photo was taken. Others looked directly at the camera, eyes wide. I turned the pages with shaking fingers, recognizing face after face. They were the same people from the missing posters. Near the end of the album, the photographs changed. They showed places instead of people: forests, basements, parking lots. Then, on the last page, there was a photo of the very basement I was standing in. The water was still, reflecting the beams of several flashlights, and there were shapes in the water, too many to count. A sound broke the silence, something soft but close. I froze, holding my breath as I listened. Another ripple moved across the water, but I hadn't moved. Slowly, I swept my flashlight around the room. There was no one there. At least no one I could see. I closed the album and started wading back toward the stairs. Every step felt slower, the water heavier. The surface seemed higher now, lapping against my thighs instead of my knees. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned, casting the flashlight back across the flooded room. The albums were still floating there, gently spinning, as if stirred by some unseen current. As I climbed the stairs, I thought I saw something move beneath the surface. Just a flicker, like a shadow passing through the murky water. I didn't wait to confirm it. I hurried up, taking the steps two at a time, my soaked boots slipping on the wet wood. I burst through the door at the top and slammed it behind me, twisting the rusted lock until it groaned shut. Back in the church, the air was warmer, but no less oppressive. I could hear something faint, almost like whispering, coming from the staircase I had just left. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I crossed the nave again, heading for the front doors. They stood wide open now, though I was certain I had closed them when I entered. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the wind had picked up. I didn't look back at the church until I was halfway across the overgrown lot. Even then, I could only bring myself to glance at the dark windows. Something flickered behind the broken glass, but I wasn't sure if it was just the wind or something else entirely. I made it to my car and drove away without stopping. Later that night, I searched for the names I had seen on the photo albums. They matched exactly with old news articles and flyers. Every person had vanished without a trace. The last thing that kept me awake wasn't just the photos or the basement. It was the fact that the final picture in the album showed the church basement, but there had been one figure clearly standing on the stairs. I was sure it had been me. Story 13. The entrance to the fallout shelter was almost completely hidden by overgrown brush and fallen branches. I found it by accident while hiking through an old forest preserve, the heavy steel hatch just barely visible beneath a layer of moss. Curiosity tugged at me as I cleared away the debris, revealing a rusted handle. It took a few hard pulls before it finally creaked open, releasing a gust of air that smelled like damp concrete and something faintly metallic. I hesitated at the top of the ladder, shining my flashlight down into the darkness. The beam caught on metal walls in a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch on for several yards. My pulse quickened, but I climbed down anyway, boots clanging against the rungs. At the bottom, the air was cooler, thick with the scent of mildew and rust, and the silence was so complete it pressed against my ears. The hallway was tight, barely wide enough for me to move without my shoulders brushing against the walls. I kept my light aimed ahead, careful where I stepped, until I reached a thick metal door slightly ajar. The room beyond was larger than I expected, its concrete walls lined with shelves filled with supplies, old canned goods, tools, and medical equipment. Everything was coated in dust, except for a table in the center where several journals were stacked neatly. I picked up the one on top. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed, but the handwriting was clear. The first few entries talked about survival preparation, stocking food, testing water filters, reinforcing the walls. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. There were detailed descriptions of something referred to only as the experiments. The writer mentioned capturing animals at first: squirrels, raccoons, even stray dogs. The entries described procedures performed on them, often in graphic detail, noting how long each subject survived. Then, weeks later, there was a shift. The entries started referring to human trials. The handwriting became more hurried, as if written in a rush. Some pages were stained with something dark that had long since dried. I set the journal down, feeling uneasy, and noticed something else in the room. Along one wall, a series of cages had been welded together from old shopping carts. The bars were bent in places, but they were reinforced with thick chains and padlocks. Some still had what looked like old, soiled bedding inside. Others were empty but bore deep scratch marks along the interior. A sound echoed faintly from deeper within the shelter. It was impossible to tell where it came from, maybe just the old structure settling. But it made me grip my flashlight tighter. I looked back at the journals and saw another lying open at the far end of the table. The handwriting was fresher, less faded, and when I leaned closer, I realized the last entry was dated only a few days ago. New subject acquired, it read. Initial conditioning complete. Responses promising. Further observation required. I swallowed hard, scanning the room again, now aware that this place wasn't abandoned. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they still were. I backed away from the table and moved toward another door in the corner of the room. It was half open, revealing a short flight of stairs leading deeper underground. Against my better judgment, I followed them down. The lower level was colder, and the air smelled worse, something sharp and chemical that stung my nose. Another room opened up at the base of the stairs, this one even more unsettling. Along the walls were metal tables fitted with restraints, each stained and pitted from years of use. Surgical tools lay neatly arranged on a nearby tray, their blades catching the beam of my flashlight. In the far corner, another journal sat on a stand, open to a page that made my stomach twist. It listed times and notes in a meticulous hand, describing various stimuli applied to a subject. Each reaction was recorded in detail, including the subject's attempts to escape and their eventual compliance. A second page underneath listed more dates, one of them today's. I was about to turn and leave when I noticed something else. A camera had been set up in the corner of the room, aimed at one of the tables. Its small red light was blinking, recording. Next to it, a monitor flickered to life, showing a live feed of a room I hadn't seen yet. Inside was another cage, larger this time, and something moved within it. It was a person. They were huddled in the corner, thin and pale, their wrists raw from restraints. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to run or help, until movement on the monitor made me freeze. Someone else entered the room. They were wearing coveralls and a mask that hid their face, holding something that looked like a syringe. They moved slowly toward the cage. I killed the flashlight and backed away from the monitor. My heart pounded in my ears as I climbed back up the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. I reached the main room again and glanced once more at the journals. I grabbed the one with the recent entries and stuffed it into my bag before turning toward the ladder that led her. As I climbed, I thought I heard the scrape of footsteps somewhere below me. I moved faster, almost slipping on one of the metal rungs, but I managed to get to the top and push the hatch open. The sunlight was blinding after so long underground, and I didn't stop to close the hatch. I ran, crashing through the undergrowth until I found the trail again. Even when I reached my car, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I drove until I was back in town, until I found a crowded gas station where I could sit in the parking lot, shaking and try to think. The journal was still in my bag. I opened it again and read more entries. They mentioned other shelters, other subjects. Whoever was behind this wasn't working alone. I never went back to the forest preserve. I reported what I found anonymously, but I don't know if anyone believed me. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being watched, if someone marked me the moment I took that journal. I still have it tucked away in a box in my closet, but I don't read it anymore. Some things are better left unread. Story 14. The trail up to the old fire lookout wasn't marked on any map I could find. I only heard about it from an old hiker who told me the tower had been abandoned for years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I packed light before heading out early in the morning. The climb was steeper than I expected, the air growing thinner and colder as I gained elevation. By late afternoon, the forest thinned out, revealing the tower in the distance. Its silhouette stood stark against the gray sky, all sharp angles and weather-beaten wood. The lookout itself was perched on rusted stilts, the narrow staircase leading up to it creaking with every step. The wind howled through broken planks, and loose nails jutted from the walls like teeth. Inside, dust coated everything in a thick film. The windows were clouded over, letting in only a dim, filtered light. A desk sat in the corner with old maps pinned beneath cracked glass. Along the opposite wall was a set of shelves lined with rusted cans, a shattered lantern, and a large leather-bound logbook resting on top of a dusty chair. I picked up the logbook, surprised by how well it had held together. Its leather cover was stiff but intact, and the pages inside were yellowed but readable. At first, it looked like a typical lookout log, with notes about weather conditions, fire warnings, and distant smoke sightings. But after a few pages, the entries began to change in tone. The handwriting became neater, almost obsessive. The entries stopped mentioning fires and started recording something else: confirmed sightings of people. Each note listed detailed descriptions of individuals, what they were wearing, where they had set up camp, and how long they'd stayed in one spot. Some pages even included sketches, crude but unmistakably human. As I read further, the word collected kept appearing. It was always written next to a date, followed by a check mark. One entry read, male mid-30s, blue parka, yellow tent, collected 10/14. No struggle. Another, family of 4, red Subaru parked at trailhead, collected over 2 nights. Minimal noise. My stomach turned as I flipped through page after page of these meticulous accounts. I stepped back from the logbook and looked around the room. Everything felt too still. I hadn't seen another hiker on the trail all day, and suddenly I wondered if anyone else even came out this far anymore. The lookout was too remote, too forgotten. But someone had been writing in that book, and the last date was only 2 weeks ago. There was a metallic clatter from below, faint but unmistakable. I moved toward the window and carefully peered down. The clearing around the tower was empty, but the wind had died, and the woods were eerily silent. I listened for several minutes but heard nothing else. I decided to keep moving. There was a trap door in the corner of the floor I hadn't noticed before. It was bolted shut with a heavy latch, but the bolt was clean and polished, not rusted like the rest of the metal in the tower. That meant someone had used it recently. I hesitated before sliding the latch free and lifting the door. The hinges let out a long, groaning creak. A narrow ladder led down into darkness. The air coming up from below smelled damp and cold, with an edge of something metallic. I clicked on my flashlight and started down. The space beneath the tower was a crawl space of sorts, with low beams and packed dirt. But toward the back, there was another door, this one steel, fitted into a concrete wall that didn't match the wooden supports of the lookout. I pressed my hand to it, feeling the chill, and gave it a push. It swung open with a faint hiss of air. Beyond was a corridor. The walls were smooth, damp concrete, and light bulbs hung from the ceiling by exposed wires. They were lit, buzzing faintly. Someone had power running here, though I had no idea how. I followed the hallway deeper, my pulse pounding in my ears. At the end of the corridor was another room. Inside were rows of shelves stacked with camping gear, tents, backpacks, shoes, water bottles, and clothes, all neatly arranged. Some looked weather-worn, but others were newer, clean, like they had just been placed there. My eyes landed on a yellow tent stuffed into one corner. It matched the description in the logbook. Next to the shelves was another desk, and on it was a second logbook, this one open to the most recent entry. It read, "Male, solo, black backpack, blue jacket, collected soon." The description fit me perfectly. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the page. The ink was still wet. I heard footsteps then. Slow, deliberate, from somewhere back down the hall. I killed my flashlight and pressed myself against the shelves, listening. The steps drew closer, the faint scrape of boots on concrete. Whoever it was didn't hurry. They knew I was here, and they weren't worried. I had to move. Quietly, I slipped through another door at the back of the room. It led to a steep, narrow staircase. I took the steps two at a time, barely breathing. At the top, I found myself back inside the lookout, the trapdoor still hanging open behind me. I bolted for the stairs outside and climbed down as fast as I could. The forest beyond the clearing stretched out in all directions, but I didn't stop to think. I picked a path and ran. My breath came hard and fast, the cold air burning my lungs. After what felt like hours, I finally stopped. The tower was long gone from view, hidden behind the thick trees. But even then, I wasn't sure I was safe. I could feel someone watching me, just beyond the edge of the trees, moving as I moved, stopping when I stopped. I made it back to my car just before nightfall. The trail was silent, and I didn't see anyone else on the drive back into town. I didn't talk to anyone about what I found. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. And sometimes I wonder if I was just let go, if I was the one they decided not to collect yet. Story 15. The apartment building had been condemned for years. Its brick facade was stained black in places, and nearly every window was broken or boarded up. No one had lived there since the fire that gutted the top floors, but people still whispered about things that happened inside long before it was abandoned. I wanted to see it for myself, maybe out of curiosity, maybe just to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. I found an opening where the front door had once been. The frame was charred and splintered, but I stepped through without much trouble. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and something else I couldn't quite place, something sour and metallic that clung to the back of my throat. My footsteps echoed as I moved down the hallway, past peeling wallpaper and rooms filled with debris. Most of the apartments I passed were empty, stripped bare by looters years ago. Doors hung from broken hinges. Floors were covered in glass and old furniture, all of it moldy and rotted. I kept going, deeper into the building, climbing the stairs slowly as they creaked under my weight. The place felt hollow, but not silent. There were sounds I couldn't explain, soft scratches or whispers that might have just been the wind. On the third floor, I noticed one door that stood out from the rest. It wasn't broken or hanging open. Instead, it was closed tightly and covered in locks. There were at least a dozen of them bolted along the edges, padlocks, deadbolts, chains, even sliding bars mounted directly into the frame. Each one was rusted but intact, and the door itself looked heavier than any of the others I had seen. I should have walked away, but something about it pulled me closer. I ran my hand along the surface, feeling the deep scratches in the wood beneath the chipped paint. The locks were old, but not impossible to deal with. I had brought tools just in case, and it didn't take long to work them open one by one. Each latch gave a dull metallic snap as I freed it, until finally the door creaked inward on its own. The smell hit me first stronger now, foul and damp, like something long dead had been left to rot inside. I hesitated for a second before stepping through the doorway. The room was small and windowless, lit only by the flashlight I held in my hand. The walls were covered in deep gouges, claw marks that cut through the plaster and into the wood beneath. In the center of the room was a stained mattress. Heavy leather restraints were bolted into the frame at each corner, their buckles rusted and stiff. The mattress itself was torn in places, the padding beneath ripped out and scattered across the floor. Something had fought hard to get free, judging by the damage. I wasn't sure if it ever had. I circled the room slowly, shining my light over every surface. There were scratches everywhere, along with smears of something dark that had dried into brittle flakes. Some of the marks weren't random. On one section of wall, I saw words carved deep into the plaster. "Help Emmy. Let Emmy out. ITS still here." The last one made me stop cold. I turned, aiming my flashlight toward the far corner of the room. There was a pile of old clothes there, torn and filthy, but nothing else. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I backed toward the door without taking my eyes off the room. That's when I noticed the locks on the inside. As many as there had been on the outside, there were just as many latches bolted to the door from this side. Whoever had been in this room had tried to lock themselves in, or something had made them do it. I couldn't tell which was worse. I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind me. For a moment I considered locking it again, but the tools in my pocket suddenly felt useless. I left the locks hanging loose and started back the way I came, moving faster now. The building was too quiet, the silence pressing against my ears until I could hear my own heartbeat pounding. I reached the stairwell and started down, but each step felt heavier than the last. The air seemed thicker, the shadows darker. Halfway down the second floor, I thought I heard a door creak open behind me. I stopped, holding my breath, listening hard. There was nothing for a long time. Then I heard a dragging sound, slow and heavy, like something scraping across the floor. I forced myself to keep going, ignoring the cold sweat running down my back. My boots slipped on the dusty stairs, and I grabbed the railing to steady myself. The dragging sound got louder. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was following me. When I reached the ground floor, I sprinted for the exit. The opening where the front door had been was just ahead, but it felt impossibly far away. The sound was closer now, right behind me. I broke into a run, stumbling out into the fading daylight, breathing hard and tasting dust and fear in every breath. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I climbed inside and slammed the door shut, locking it out of habit. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the building stood silent and still. But as I watched, I thought I saw a shadow move past one of the broken windows. Something was still inside. I drove away without looking back again. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the room with the claw marks in the mattress. I saw the words carved into the wall, and I heard the locks clicking shut. I wondered who had been kept in there, and if they had ever gotten out, or if something else had taken their place. I never went back to that building. A few months later, they finally tore it down. But sometimes I wonder if the workers found anything while they were gutting the place. I wonder if they saw the room on the 3rd floor with the dozens of locks. And I wonder if they locked it up again before they left. Story 16. The nursing home had been closed for nearly 30 years. I found it by accident while hiking along an old service road that had long since been overtaken by weeds and moss. The building was set back behind a line of twisted trees, its roof sagging and its windows clouded with grime. Something about it drew me in, even though I knew I should have left it alone. The front doors hung crooked on their hinges, but they opened with a hard push. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old plaster, mixed with something sour that clung to the back of my throat. Dust hung in the beams of light that managed to sneak through cracks in the walls. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the floor under my boots. Most of the rooms were empty. Some still had rusted bed frames or peeling wallpaper, and a few had scattered papers and medical charts littering the floors. I wandered slowly, keeping an eye on the sagging ceiling above me. Every so often I found old personal belongings, broken picture frames, worn shoes, a cracked pair of glasses left on a windowsill. I was about to turn back when I found the room at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, its door was still shut. I hesitated before pushing it open, half expecting it to resist, but it swung out smoothly. Inside, the room was small and square, the walls bare except for a few yellowed scraps of tape where something had once hung. There was a table in the center of the room, and on it, stacks of paper were piled high. Some had fallen to the floor, and I bent to pick one up. It was a drawing done in heavy pencil lines, rough and uneven, but clear enough. It showed a face. A pale, long face with hollow eyes and a thin mouth staring through a window pane. I set it down and picked up another. The same face. This time the perspective was wider, showing more of the window and a dark outline of a hand pressed to the glass. I flipped through more of the drawings, and they were all the same. Dozens of them, all depicting the same figure outside a window, always watching. The more I looked, the more unsettled I became. Each drawing was signed in shaky handwriting with different names. It was clear these had been drawn by different people, but the subject never changed. Every picture captured the same gaunt face, as if it had been burned into each person's mind. I noticed there was a date scribbled on the back of many drawings. Most were spaced out by days, sometimes weeks. But there was one stretch where the drawings came day after day, sometimes several on the same date. I could almost feel the growing desperation in the drawings, as if whoever made them had been trying to capture some detail or warn someone. The window in the drawings looked familiar. I turned toward the room's single window and saw it match the one in the pictures. Same simple design, same chipped frame. I stepped closer and pressed my hand to the cold glass. Beyond it was just the tangled woods. Empty. Still, I found myself glancing from side to side, half expecting to see something standing there. There was a chair by the window, its cushions sunken and torn. I wondered how long someone had sat there, watching, waiting, maybe looking for the face they kept seeing in their mind. The air in the room felt heavy, as though someone had only just stepped out and might return at any moment. I left the drawings on the table and crossed to the small dresser in the corner. The top drawer stuck, but after a few hard pulls, it slid open with a groan. Inside were more papers, but these were different. Medical records. Notes from doctors and nurses describing the patients who had stayed in that room. Each note mentioned the same symptoms: paranoia, hallucinations, sleeplessness. They all wrote about a man at the window. Some described patients screaming at night, claiming they saw someone watching them. Others mentioned drawings, compulsive sketches of the same pale figure. The staff had even conducted psychological evaluations, but there was never any real explanation. The records ended abruptly, with no clear resolution. I set them back in the drawer and stepped away, my skin crawling. Something about the room felt wrong, like the air was pressing too close. I checked the window again, but nothing was there. Just a gray sky and dead trees. I left the room and shut the door behind me. The hallway was silent, but it no longer felt empty. I could hear faint sounds as I made my way back toward the entrance, whispers I couldn't quite make out, or maybe just the wind through the broken glass. I didn't stop to figure it out. When I stepped outside, I took a long breath of fresh air. The trees swayed slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw something pale between them. It was gone before I could be sure. I told myself it was just my imagination, twisted by the strange things I'd seen inside. Even now, weeks later, I can still picture the face from those drawings. Hollow, thin, watching through the window with expressionless eyes. I wonder how many people drew it before the place was abandoned. I wonder if they ever really saw it, or if something made them believe they did. Sometimes at night I catch myself glancing toward my own window. I know it's foolish, but I can't help it. I keep expecting to see that same pale face staring back at me through the glass. And one of these nights I think I will. Story 17. I've been hiking those hills for years, but I'd never seen anything like it before. The entrance was half buried under brush and loose dirt. A rusty steel door barely visible beneath layers of leaves and moss. It didn't look like much from the outside, just another forgotten relic, but something about it made me stop. I cleared away enough debris to get a good grip on the handle and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, metal grinding against metal, but it gave way. A damp smell rushed out to meet me, thick with the scent of earth and decay. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness inside, revealing concrete walls streaked with moisture and old rust stains. The narrow tunnel sloped down sharply, disappearing into the earth like a throat-swallowing light. I hesitated at the threshold, the air cooler here than it had any right to be. Still, curiosity pushed me forward. My boots scraped along the dusty floor as I made my way inside, the light dancing over faded warning signs and peeling paint. About 20 feet in, the tunnel widened into a chamber. The room was empty, except for a metal table in the center, and what looked like a corkboard mounted to the far wall. I moved toward the board, my footsteps echoing off the concrete. It was covered in lists, all neatly written in black marker, some in straight lines, others hastily scrawled in smaller spaces when room ran out. Each name had a red X drawn through it. I scanned the names, noticing the dates scribbled beside some of them. They stretched back decades, the earliest ones faded but still legible. Some names were familiar, common ones I'd heard before, but others felt oddly specific, like they belonged to people you might hear about in small-town news stories. There were hundreds of them. Then I saw it. Near the bottom of the board, in handwriting fresher and darker than the rest, was my name. It was just sitting there, plain and simple, but it made my chest tighten. There wasn't an X next to it like the others. Just my name. A space left beside it, as if waiting for something. I backed away without meaning to, bumping into the cold edge of the metal table. My mind raced through explanations, none of them good. Someone had been down here recently. Recently enough to know my name, to add it to a list that made no sense. I ran a finger along the writing, feeling the raised lines of the marker. It was dry, but it couldn't have been there for long. I swung my flashlight around the room again, half expecting someone to be standing in the shadows. Nothing but walls and dust. On the table were more lists, this time scribbled on sheets of paper, some torn, others folded. I picked one up. Names again. More red chests. Some had notes beside them, times, places, single words like found or done. I dropped the papers and stepped back. There was a tightness in my chest now that I couldn't ignore. I didn't know who had made these lists or why, but I knew I didn't want to be part of them. I turned toward the tunnel, ready to leave, but then I heard something that froze me in place. A faint sound, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from deeper within the bunker, beyond the room I had thought was the end. I held my breath, listening, heart pounding in my ears. The steps stopped. Silence settled again, heavy and unnatural. I forced myself to move, walking quickly but quietly back toward the entrance. Each step felt like it took forever. I didn't look back. I kept the flashlight beam pointed ahead, watching the exit grow closer, the faint daylight a thin line beyond the door. I was almost there when something scraped behind me, sharp and sudden. I broke into a run, bursting out of the bunker and into the sunlight, stumbling over the roots and loose soil I'd cleared earlier. I scrambled to my feet and didn't stop moving until I reached the ridge where I'd left my truck. My keys shook in my hand as I jammed them into the ignition and started the engine. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the dirt road leading away from the hills. Even then, I half expected to see someone standing at the top of the ridge, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the trees and the quiet hills behind them. That night, I locked every door and window in my house. I checked them twice, then a third time for good measure. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had followed me back, even though I hadn't seen a car behind me on the road. I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the street through the curtains. The next morning, I went through everything I could remember. I searched online for any mention of the bunker, the lists, anything that made sense. There was nothing. No records. No local stories, no old rumors. I checked the names I'd remembered seeing, but they didn't turn up in any obvious way. I kept thinking about the X. A few days later, I went out to my truck and found something tucked under the windshield wiper. A single sheet of paper, plain and folded in half. I opened it with hands that didn't feel steady. My name was written across the top, the same handwriting I'd seen on the wall of the bunker. Below it was a time, written in red marker, midnight. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the dark again, watching the clock move toward midnight, listening for any sound that didn't belong. When the time came and passed, nothing happened. But I knew it wasn't over. I knew they were out there, somewhere. I haven't been back to the hills since. I don't go anywhere alone anymore. But I still check the windows every night, and I never let my guard down. Because I keep thinking about that wall in the bunker, about the red X next to every name but mine, and I know it's only a matter of time. Story 18. The hunting lodge sat deep in the woods, far from any roads or marked trails. I found it by chance while following an old map I picked up at a thrift store. The structure was weathered but solid, its logs darkened by age and moss creeping along the edges. A chill settled in my bones as I stepped onto the porch, but I told myself it was only the cold. Inside, the air was still and heavy, carrying the faint scent of old smoke and damp wood. The furniture was simple and worn, the kind of place built for men who didn't care about comfort. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, ashes still scattered in the hearth, as if someone had used it not too long ago. I ran my hand along the mantel, brushing away a thin layer of dust. I set my bag down near the doorway and took a slow walk through the lodge. There were 2 bedrooms in the back, both with bunks and wool blankets folded neatly on top. The small kitchen sat just off the main room, its shelves mostly bare except for a few rusty cans. The place had an unsettling sense of order, as if it was always prepared for the next visitor, though no one had come in a long time. On the table in the center of the room lay a guest book, its leather cover cracked with age. I flipped it open, curiosity tugging at me more than caution. Names filled the pages, each scrawled in a different hand. Next to every name was a single word written in bold letters, either cleared or taken. I skimmed through the pages, heart beating a little faster with each line I read. Most names had dates beside them, all from years ago, though some were more recent. I turned to the last page and saw my own name already written there. The date was today's, but the space next to it was still blank. I stared at the empty space for a long time. My fingers traced the letters of my name, trying to make sense of how it had gotten there. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't even opened the book until now. I closed it and stepped back, feeling a tightness growing in my chest. Outside, the sky had grown darker, and the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, not even a bar. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't planning on staying long anyway. But the way the shadows stretched across the floor made me think twice about stepping back out into the woods before dawn. I decided to light a fire in the hearth, more for the sense of safety than for warmth. The wood stacked beside it was dry, and the fire caught quickly. The light flickered across the walls, making the mounted deer head seem almost alive in the shifting glow. I pulled a chair close and sat down, trying to quiet the growing unease in my gut. Hours passed, or maybe it was less than that. The wind howled outside like something alive, and I kept glancing at the windows. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that the lodge was old and filled with stories it didn't deserve. But when I stood up to check the guest book again, I found it open. The page with my name was there, still blank next to it. I shut the book quickly and placed it back on the table, more forceful than I meant to. The air in the room felt heavier than before. I walked to the door and checked the lock, sliding the deadbolt into place. Then I dragged one of the chairs in front of it, just in case. As night pressed harder against the windows, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the frost outside. Slow, steady, circling the lodge. I froze by the fire, listening, holding my breath until my lungs burned. But the footsteps never came closer, never tried the door, just circled. At some point, exhaustion dragged me down into sleep. I don't remember lying down, but I woke to find myself on one of the bunks in the back room. The fire had burned low, casting dim orange light against the walls. I sat up slowly, blinking against the gloom, and realized something was different. The guest book was open again. I could see it from the doorway, I crossed the room with slow steps, cold filling my veins. My name was still there, but now beside it was a word, cleared. I exhaled, shaking, not sure whether to feel relief or something else. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt like a verdict, and the weight of it settled deep in my bones. I closed the book carefully this time and placed it back on the table. Morning came gray and silent. I packed my things quickly, barely finishing my coffee before I shoved the rest of my supplies into my bag. The lodge felt different in the daylight, emptier somehow, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I stepped outside, I found footprints in the frost. They circled the lodge just as I thought, looping around again and again. But they never led away, as if whoever made them was still there, watching, waiting. I didn't stop walking until I was miles from the place. I didn't look back, though I felt the weight of unseen eyes the entire time. When I finally made it back to my car, I sat there with my hands on the wheel, unsure if I had truly left it all behind. Later that night, as I lay in my bed back home, I thought about the guest book, about how it had already known my name. I wondered who kept it updated, and what exactly decided if someone was cleared or taken. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I tried to find the lodge on a map again, but it wasn't there. I drove back toward the woods, but the old paths were gone, overgrown as if no one had walked them in years. I turned back when the sun dipped low, not wanting to press my luck. But every so often, I hear footsteps outside my house. Slow, steady, circling. And sometimes I wonder if I really was cleared, or if I'm still waiting for someone to make the final decision. Story 19. The old mall had been abandoned for years. Its glass ceiling was stained with grime, and weeds pushed up through cracks in the tile floors. Most of the storefronts had been gutted, their signs faded or missing entirely. I had always wanted to see what was left inside, and one quiet afternoon I finally worked up the nerve to go in. The air inside was still, heavy with dust and mildew. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I walked past empty shops and food court tables left to rust. Pieces of old posters hung in tatters from the walls, and escalators stood frozen with rust coating their handrails. Everything felt forgotten, as if time had stopped here years ago. I moved deeper into the mall, passing stores with shattered windows and broken display cases. Some still had a few hangers swaying on racks, but most were bare. There was an odd hush to the place, like even the birds and insects avoided it. The farther I went, the colder it seemed to get, despite the heat of the day outside. One store caught my eye near the end of a long corridor. Unlike the others, it wasn't dark inside. The display window was clean, and soft white light spilled out through the glass. Above the entrance, the sign was missing, but there was something strange about how intact everything looked. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer to get a better look. Inside, mannequins stood in neat rows, each one dressed carefully. Their clothes were modern, not like the dated outfits I had seen in other windows. Some wore jackets I recognized, brands that were still sold in town. A few even had shoes I was sure I had seen people wear. I stood there staring, feeling a twist of unease in my gut. I stepped inside the store, the door creaking faintly as I pushed it open. The lights buzzed softly overhead, casting an unnatural glow over everything. The mannequins were arranged like they were waiting for someone to buy their clothes. Each one had a name tag pinned to its chest, handwritten in neat letters. The first one I read made my blood run cold. It was a name I recognized, Sarah Hill. She'd gone missing 6 months ago. Her mannequin wore the same leather jacket I had seen her in on the posters. There was even a silver necklace around its neck, identical to the one described in the articles. My fingers trembled as I reached out and touched the sleeve. The fabric was warm, like it had just been worn. I moved down the row, looking at more of the mannequins. Each one had a name I knew. People who had vanished in the past year. Jason Lee wearing his old team jersey. Monica Alvarez in the blue sundress her family said she was last seen wearing. There were details too exact to be coincidence: scuff marks on shoes, tiny rings on fingers, a watch stopped at the time of disappearance. Some of them had personal items displayed on small stands next to them. A backpack with initials embroidered on it. A keychain with faded photos inside. Things that should have been with them when they were last seen. I stared at the mannequin of David Cho, who had gone missing on his way home from work. His glasses perched on his nose, and his shoes were the same pair I had seen on missing posters, worn down on one side. The farther I walked, the more real it all seemed. None of the mannequins looked plastic up close. Their skin had a texture that was too perfect, like someone had gone to incredible lengths to make them lifelike. Their hair wasn't synthetic. It was real, with strands that varied in thickness and color. When I leaned in close, I thought I could see pores. At the back of the store, a large mirror stretched from floor to ceiling. In front of it was one last mannequin, different from the others. It wore an outfit I recognized immediately my own. The jacket I had on now was draped over its shoulders, and its shoes were identical to mine. There was even a small scar on its cheek, matching one I got years ago in a bike accident. I stared at it in shock, feeling my heart thudding in my chest. My name was pinned to its chest in the same neat handwriting. The mannequin's eyes seemed to look right through me, empty and blank but focused somehow. I took a shaky step back, and that's when I noticed something else. There was a door behind the mirror, slightly ajar, with faint light coming from the crack. My body moved on its own as I crossed the floor toward the door. I pushed it open slowly, revealing a narrow hallway. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding small glass jars. Inside the jars were labels with names and dates, and something else: hair, bits of jewelry, sometimes a tooth. I walked down the row, reading name after name. They all matched the mannequins out front. At the end of the hall, there was another room. This one had a workbench and tools laid out in careful rows. Scissors, needles, scalpels, a sewing machine with dark stains on the surface. I spotted more clothes hanging on hooks along the walls. Some of them were half finished, as if someone was in the middle of assembling them. There were even more mannequins here, some without heads or limbs. I turned back toward the hallway, my breathing ragged. My eyes darted around, trying to find another way out, but the store was silent again. I stepped back into the main room, and all the mannequins were exactly where I had left them. Yet the one that looked like me seemed closer than before. I forced myself to move, walking quickly toward the entrance. Every second felt heavy, as if the air itself was thickening. When I reached the door, it resisted for a moment before swinging open with a groan. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the mall, my footsteps pounding against the tiles, until I burst out into the daylight. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. As I drove away, I glanced back at the mall in the rearview mirror. The store's lights were still on, glowing faintly in the gloom. I haven't told anyone about what I saw there, but I noticed things now. People staring a second too long, clothing that looks too familiar. And sometimes when I walk past a shop window, I catch a glimpse of a reflection that isn't quite mine. Story 20. The old water treatment plant had been abandoned for years, sitting quietly on the edge of town where the trees grew thick and wild. It had always intrigued me. This hulking structure covered in rust and vines, its broken windows staring out like empty eyes. I'd heard stories about it when I was younger, how kids would dare each other to step inside, how some people said they heard voices when they got too close. One cloudy afternoon, with nothing better to do, I decided to see it for myself. Getting inside wasn't hard. A section of chain link fence had been cut away, and there was a wide enough gap to squeeze through. The main entrance doors hung lopsided on their hinges, creaking slightly whenever the wind blew. I stepped inside, the sound of my boots on the concrete floor echoing through the hollow space, dust swirling in the shafts of pale light cutting through the broken ceiling. Most of the rooms were empty, filled only with rusted pipes and twisted metal. Some were flooded, murky water reflecting the cracked tiles above. The place smelled damp and metallic, with an undertone of something sour that made me breathe through my mouth. It was quiet, too quiet, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. I made my way deeper inside, finding staircases that led both up and down, though some had caved in entirely. After about an hour of wandering, I found a room that seemed different from the rest. The heavy metal door was still intact and slightly ajar, as if someone had gone in and forgotten to close it properly. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The first thing I noticed was the wall directly opposite the door. It was completely covered with missing person posters, some yellowed with age, others looking almost new. Faces stared back at me, men, women, even children, all frozen in time with hopeful smiles and simple descriptions beneath their photographs. There must have been dozens of them, maybe even 100, tacked up in overlapping rows. On another wall, large maps of the surrounding area had been pinned up. Trails wound through forests and hills, marked in different colors. Some paths were circled in red, others crossed out entirely. Someone had made notes in the margins with thick black marker, scribbles that were hard to read from where I stood. I stepped closer, scanning the maps and trying to make sense of the markings. Certain trails were labeled with dates, some recent and some going back years. A few had symbols next to them, strange ones that looked like they belonged on cave walls, not modern maps. I felt a chill work its way down my spine as I realized the circled trails matched areas where hikers had gone missing over the years. The floor was littered with scraps of paper, notebooks with pages torn out, and Polaroid photographs that had been left to gather dust. Many of the photos showed the same trails as the maps, but others were harder to look at. One was a close-up of a torn backpack, half buried in the dirt. Another showed something pale and unmoving at the bottom of a ravine, too blurry to make out clearly. In the corner of the room, there was an old desk with drawers hanging open. Inside were more maps, rolled up and tied with twine, and a handful of plastic evidence bags filled with small personal items, watches, necklaces, even a cracked cell phone. Whoever had been in this room had been keeping track of everything. It wasn't just random clutter. It was organized, methodical, like someone had been searching for something or someone. I tried to tell myself this was the work of a concerned citizen, someone who had taken an interest in helping find the missing. But the longer I stood there, the more that explanation didn't sit right. There was something obsessive about the way the information had been collected. It was too much, too detailed. Whoever had done this had spent years gathering it all, and there was no sign of who they were or where they had gone. A sudden sound made me jump, a faint metallic clatter from somewhere deeper in the building. I stood perfectly still, listening. It came again, closer this time, like something brushing against a rusted pipe. I told myself it was probably just the wind or an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I backed away from the wall of posters, careful not to make any noise. My pulse was pounding in my ears and my hands felt clammy. I turned toward the door, suddenly desperate to leave, but froze when I saw something on the floor, just outside the room. It was a boot print, still damp, as if someone had stepped through water not long ago. For a moment I thought about calling out, but instinct told me to stay quiet. Whoever was here hadn't made their presence known yet, and I wasn't about to change that. I slipped out of the room as quietly as I could, keeping close to the wall, and made my way back the way I had come. The building seemed darker now, the hallways narrower. Every creak of the floor beneath my feet sounded deafening. I resisted the urge to look back, even when I thought I heard something trailing behind me. My only goal was to reach the hole in the fence and get out of there as fast as I could. When I finally stepped back outside, the light was fading fast, and the air felt heavy. I hurried through the gap in the fence and didn't stop until I was well away from the plant, the old building disappearing behind the trees. Only then did I allow myself to stop and breathe. I never told anyone about what I found in that room. Sometimes I think about going back, maybe trying to understand what it all meant, but I never do. The faces on those posters still haunt me, and I wonder if someone else is still adding to them. Story 21. The old shipyard sat at the edge of the bay, hidden behind a rusted chain-link fence and rows of crumbling warehouses. Most of the docks were broken and sagging, barely clinging to their pilings. I hadn't planned to stop there, but something about the place drew me in. It felt like the kind of place people forgot, the kind of place where things got left behind. I parked my car just outside the fence and climbed through a gap where the metal had twisted away. The smell of salt and decay was thick in the air. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the sound of water lapping against rotting wood. As I walked down the cracked concrete pier, I noticed something strange. There was a boat still floating in the water, tied tightly to the dock with heavy chains. Most of the other boats were long gone or reduced to wrecks, but this one looked intact. Its hull was streaked with grime, and the paint had long since peeled away, but it sat steady on the dark water like it had never left. I stepped closer and saw that its name had been scratched off the side. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing one of the chains and pulling myself toward the deck. The boat creaked under my weight, but it didn't move much. It was as if the water itself had gone still around it. The deck was slick and cold under my boots, and I moved carefully toward the cabin door, which hung slightly open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made me think of old blood. Dust coated everything. A cracked lantern hung from a hook, swaying slightly with the motion of the boat. There wasn't much in the small cabin, just a table, a chair bolted to the floor, and something lying open on the table. It was a journal, its cover worn smooth with age. The pages were yellowed and stained, but the handwriting inside was surprisingly neat. I flipped to the first page and saw a date. It was from nearly 40 years ago. Below it, a single line was written in careful script: "Acquisition begins." At first, I wasn't sure what I was reading. The entries were methodical, listing names, ages, and physical descriptions. There were also locations, small towns, and isolated farms. Some entries mentioned how easy or difficult the acquisition had been. Some names were crossed out with a line through them, with notes like damaged goods or unsuitable. The deeper I read, the colder I felt. These weren't just records of people, they were records of people taken. Abducted. There were references to transfers, deliveries, and cargo holds. One entry described a woman who had fought too hard, forcing them to dispose of her overboard. Another detailed a child who had gone quiet after 3 days, requiring encouragement. I closed the book for a moment, feeling sick. I told myself to leave, to get back to the dock and forget I had ever found this place. But instead, I opened the journal again, flipping toward the back. The handwriting became more hurried, the notes more chaotic. There were entries marked with dates from only a few months ago. One of the last pages listed 3 names. Underneath was a note, final shipment scheduled. Departure at dusk. There was no year listed, no indication of when it had happened. But when I glanced out the grimy window toward the horizon, I realized the sun was starting to set. I backed away from the table and turned to leave, but something made me stop. There was a hatch in the floor behind the chair, the edges scratched as though it had been opened and closed many times. Against my better judgment, I crouched down and pulled it open. The smell that hit me was worse than anything I had imagined. The space below was small and dark. Rusted chains hung from hooks in the ceiling, and there were deep gouges in the walls. On the floor, I saw old stains that told their own story. At the far end, I thought I saw something move, a faint rustle, like breath. I slammed the hatch shut and stumbled back toward the door. As I stepped out onto the deck, I heard a sound coming from the shore. It was faint at first, but growing louder footsteps on the dock, slow, deliberate. I crouched low, peering over the edge of the boat. A group of figures was making their way down the pier. There were 4 of them, dressed in dark clothing, moving like they knew exactly where they were going. One of them was carrying something that looked like a large duffel bag. I didn't wait to see more. I dropped quietly over the side of the boat and into the cold water. The shock of it stole my breath, but I forced myself to stay quiet, holding onto the edge of the hull. I watched as the men climbed aboard the boat, speaking in low voices. One of them went into the cabin. A few moments later, the others followed, dragging the bag with them. I used that moment to swim toward the dock, staying low in the water. My arms ached, and the cold bit into my skin, but I didn't stop until I reached a gap in the dock supports. I pulled myself underneath and waited, teeth chattering. I could hear faint voices from the boat, and then the sound of the chains rattling. After what felt like forever, there was silence again. I didn't move until full darkness had fallen. When I finally climbed out from under the dock, I kept low and moved quickly back toward the fence. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, slamming the door and locking it behind me. As I drove away from the shipyard, I kept expecting headlights to appear behind me, or worse, to find one of them sitting in my back seat. But the road stayed empty, and I made it back to town without seeing another soul. I never told anyone about what I found there. Some things, I think, are better left to sink beneath the surface. Story 22. The resort was farther into the mountains than I expected. It took half a day of hiking before I even saw the roofline peeking above the treetops. By the time I reached the front entrance, the sun had already dipped low behind the ridge. The place was massive, the kind of place that had once been alive with tourists and music, but now it stood silent and crumbling. The front doors were still intact, though they hung slightly ajar. Pushing them open released a breath of stale, cold air that smelled of wood rot and something metallic. Inside, the lobby was coated in dust, but most of the furniture was still in place. Faded signs pointed toward the dining hall, the spa, and something labeled simply ballroom. I made my way deeper into the building, each step echoing off cracked tile floors. The windows were grimy but let in just enough light to cast long shadows. Here and there I found old suitcases, mildewed coats draped over chairs, and abandoned shoes. It was like people had left in a hurry, though there was no sign of violence or struggle. The ballroom was at the end of a long corridor. As I approached, I noticed the double doors were closed, unlike everything else in the building. One of the brass handles was tarnished, the other polished as if it had been touched recently. I hesitated before grabbing it, half expecting to hear something on the other side. When I pushed open the doors, the smell hit me first. It was old wood, damp cloth, and something faintly sour beneath it all. The ballroom was enormous, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, their glass cracked and streaked with grime. Light filtered in through breaks in the clouds, giving everything a gray, washed-out glow. Rows of chairs were lined up neatly, each one facing an empty stage. At first, I thought it was some kind of setup for an event that had never happened. But as I stepped closer, I noticed every chair had a name tag taped to its backrest. The handwriting was clean, block letters and black marker. I walked the first row slowly, reading each tag. The names were unfamiliar at first, but something about them felt unsettling. They sounded too normal, too familiar in a way I couldn't quite explain. Halfway down the third row, I froze. One of the tags had my last name on it. I stared at it for a long time, then moved to the next chair. Another name, another last name matching mine, and the next, and the next. I kept going, moving faster now. Every single chair had a name tag, and they all shared my last name. Some had first names I recognized from my family tree, distant cousins and great-uncles. Others I had never heard before, but they were all tied to me. It was impossible, but there it was, row after row after row. Then I noticed the nooses. Thick ropes hung from the ceiling directly above each chair, looped and knotted. They swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. The ceiling was high, the ropes disappearing into the shadows above. There was something about the way they hung, too precise, too deliberate, like they had been measured exactly for each seat. I backed away slowly, my boots scuffing the dusty floor. The silence in the room was deep, heavy in a way that made my ears ring. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint creak, like the sound of a rope pulled taut. I turned toward the doors, but they had swung shut behind me. I didn't remember closing them. When I reached them, they wouldn't budge. I yanked the handles hard, but they held firm as if welded shut. My breath came quicker, and I turned back to the room, looking for another exit. That's when I saw someone sitting in one of the chairs. It was a man, still and silent, hands folded neatly in his lap. His head was bowed, the rope just above his neck. I hadn't seen him when I entered. I stared, unsure whether to call out. Before I could, he lifted his head slowly and turned to look at me. His face was pale and slack, his eyes dull like glass marbles. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then he stood, slow and stiff, and pointed to an empty chair in the front row. The name tag on that chair had my first and last name written in perfect black letters. I stepped back again, but another chair creaked behind me. Another figure was there now, a woman with long dark hair covering her face. She was already standing, her arms rising to gesture toward the same chair. More sounds followed, creaks and soft footsteps, until I realized others were rising from their seats. Each one turned toward me with that same hollow stare. I bolted for the side of the room, shoving chairs aside as I ran. The ropes above me swayed more violently now, some of them lowering as if being pulled by invisible hands. I reached a door at the far end, half hidden by a velvet curtain, and shoved it open. It led to a narrow hallway, barely lit and damp with mold. I ran without thinking, without looking back. The sound of footsteps followed me, slow and steady, like they weren't in a hurry, because they knew I couldn't get far. The hall twisted and turned until it spat me out into what used to be a kitchen. The windows here were broken. Without thinking, I climbed through one, cutting my hands on the glass but not caring. I landed hard on the ground outside, scraping my knees. When I looked up, the ballroom windows loomed above me, dark shapes pressed against the glass. They watched silently, their faces pale and blank. I ran down the mountain path without stopping. When I reached my car, I didn't wait to catch my breath. I drove as fast as I could, not caring about the narrow curves or the drop-offs on either side. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally stopped. Even now, I'm not sure what I saw in that ballroom. But sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear the creak of ropes in the ceiling above me. And when I check my door in the morning, I sometimes find a single chair sitting in front of it, with my name written on a tag taped to the back. Story 23. The old textile mill had been abandoned for decades, or at least that's what people in town said. I'd passed by it countless times, its rusted smokestack looming over the trees like a skeleton of another time. Curiosity got the better of me one cloudy afternoon, and I found myself squeezing through a gap in the chain-link fence. The yard was overgrown, concrete cracked with weeds pushing through like veins, and the silence was thick enough to feel. The main building wasn't hard to get into. Several windows on the ground floor had long since been broken, and the main door hung from one hinge. Inside, it smelled of dust and oil, with faint hints of something musty that caught at the back of my throat. My boots echoed on the concrete floors as I wandered through empty workrooms, past rusted looms and piles of shredded fabric that had once been bright with color. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but the deeper I went, the heavier the air seemed to get. The dye room was toward the back, behind a set of swinging doors that creaked as they moved. The temperature dropped noticeably as I stepped inside, the light from my flashlight catching on large vats that lined the walls. They looked like huge metal cauldrons stained with streaks of dark color, some capped, others wide open. At first I thought the vats still held water, remnants of old dye baths long dried out. But as I moved closer, I realized something was floating in a murky liquid. Shoes. Dozens of them. Some old, cracked leather that looked like it had been there for years, but others seemed much newer. One sneaker was half submerged, its laces tangled, the sole still white beneath the grime. I leaned in, feeling sick, and saw a child's sandal resting on top of a stained jacket. There was something dark on the fabric, dried blood, dark brown and flaking. I backed away, but curiosity tugged at me again. I moved to the next vat and found more of the same. Clothes, shoes, even belts, all floating together like they'd been dumped without care. Some of them were soaked through, still dripping, as if they hadn't been there long. A sour smell rose from one of the vats, thick and metallic. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and turned toward a row of cabinets along the wall. The doors hung open, and inside were neatly folded stacks of clothes. Some were children's sizes, others clearly adult. Each pile was tagged with a strip of faded paper, but the writing was smeared, impossible to read. The tags looked fresh though, too fresh. I kept my flashlight steady as I moved farther back into the room. There was a small office at the rear, its door hanging open. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs pinned up haphazardly. Some were old black and white, curled at the edges, but others were recent, printed on glossy paper. Every photo showed a person standing against a plain wall facing the camera. Some smiled, others didn't. Most looked like they hadn't slept in days. There were names scrawled under some of the photos, along with dates. I stepped closer and realized some of the dates were from the past week. My stomach dropped as I noticed a familiar face, among them a guy from town who had gone missing last year. His photo was newer than the others, and there was a faint smudge across his cheek, as if someone had brushed against it with dirty fingers. A noise echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. It was faint, like something metal scraping against concrete. I froze, straining to hear, but the sound stopped. I turned off my flashlight and stood there in the dark, holding my breath. After a long minute, I turned the light back on and backed out of the office, careful not to bump into the walls. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I found a set of stairs near the corner of the dye room, leading down into the basement. Against my better judgment, I crept down them, the air growing colder with every step. The basement was damp, the walls slick with condensation. A faint hum came from deeper inside, like machinery still running on some ancient generator. The sound was steady, almost soothing if it weren't so out of place. In the middle of the room was another set of vats, smaller but arranged in a neat row. These weren't full of clothes. Instead, they held bones. Human bones, by the look of them, stacked neatly like firewood. Some still had bits of flesh clinging to them, pale and slick, while others had been stripped clean. There was a metal table nearby with tools laid out, saws, knives, something that looked like a bone drill. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want to know who had done this, or why. All I knew was that I needed to leave before whoever ran this place came back. As I turned to leave, I noticed something scrawled on the far wall in what looked like dry dye, though I suspected it was something worse. Clean in process, sort by size. I made my way back up the stairs as quietly as I could, but every creak of the wood beneath my feet made me flinch. I didn't stop in the dye room. I didn't look at the photographs again. I just ran, bolting through the main room and out through the broken door. I didn't stop until I was past the fence, back on the road, where the air felt clean and the sky was still light. Even now, I don't understand what I found in that mill. I never went back, and I never told anyone exactly what I saw. Sometimes I hear rumors about other mills in nearby towns, places that have been shut down for years but still have lights in the windows at night. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those vats again, clothes floating like they're waiting to be worn. I wonder who they belong to, and if anyone else will end up in that room, sorted by size, tagged and cataloged, like they were just another piece of inventory. Story 24. The farmhouse was old, sitting at the edge of a wide field with no neighbors for miles. It belonged to a friend of a friend, someone who let people stay there now and then to get away from the noise of the city. I thought it would be a quiet place to clear my head for a few days. The idea of no power and no cell service sounded peaceful when I agreed to go. When I arrived, the sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows across the cracked wooden porch. The house smelled of dust and dry wood as I stepped inside. Everything inside was basic: a table, a few chairs, a wood-burning stove, and an old metal bed frame with a mattress that sagged in the middle. There was no electricity, no running water, and no sounds except for the creaks and groans of the house settling. I unpacked my things and lit a few candles. There were lanterns, but they seemed rusted shut, and I didn't feel like struggling with them. After eating some cold food I brought with me, I settled into bed, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. It was quiet in a way I wasn't used to, but I told myself that was what I wanted. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I noticed a faint flicker of light. It wasn't candlelight. It was quick, sharp, and white. A flash. Then another. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dark as I sat up and scanned the room. In the corner, by the far wall, I saw something small and dark standing on a tripod. Another flash went off, and I realized it was a camera. It was pointed directly at the bed. Every few seconds, the flash triggered again. The sound had been so faint I hadn't noticed it before. I got out of bed and walked over to it. My hands were shaking as I reached for the device. It was an old digital camera, the kind you don't see much anymore. The screen was cracked, but the light from the flash gave me enough to see that it was still recording. I turned it off and slid the memory card out. For a moment, I just stood there in the dark, feeling the silence press in around me. There was no one else supposed to be in the house. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. The door had still been locked from the inside. I told myself it must have been left behind by someone who stayed here before, but that didn't explain why it had been pointed at me, flashing all night. In the morning, I took the memory card out to the porch where there was better light. I connected it to my laptop, which I had charged before coming out here. There were hundreds of photos on it. Each one was of me. Some were taken from far away, through the windows while I was walking around the house. Others were taken while I sat at the table eating dinner. The majority were taken while I slept. The timestamps were strange. Some were marked with dates from weeks ago before I had even planned the trip. Others were from just hours earlier, while I had been in bed. Each photo showed me lying there in different positions. Some with my eyes closed, some where it almost looked like I was awake, staring at the ceiling. I felt sick, scrolling through them. My heart was pounding in my ears as I looked toward the tree line. It was impossible to tell how long someone had been watching the house, or how they got inside. I started packing my things immediately. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, suffocating. Just as I was stuffing my laptop into my bag, I noticed something else on the camera. Another folder. This one was labeled with dates stretching back years. Curious in spite of myself, I opened it. More photos. None of them were of me. They showed other people in different rooms, but the setting was always the same house. Some were taken during the day, others in the dead of night. In one set, a woman was sitting at the same table I had eaten at. Another set showed an older man, standing by the fireplace, staring into the empty grate. The last photos were always of them asleep, the same angle, the same framing as mine. And in each case there was a final photo, a close-up of their faces, pale, eyes open but lifeless. I slammed the laptop shut and threw it into my bag. I couldn't be there another minute. I didn't care about leaving things behind. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car, my head snapping around to scan the fields and tree line as I went. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, watching me leave. The car struggled to start at first. The engine groaned before finally catching, and I peeled out of the gravel driveway so fast the tires kicked up dust behind me. It wasn't until I was several miles away that I let myself breathe again. Even then I didn't feel safe. I stayed in a motel that night, in a room with lights that worked and locks that clicked firmly into place. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the farmhouse and the camera, about who had set it up and how many others had stayed there before me. I thought about the folder with the old photos and the way the people in them always ended up the same way. I reported what I found to the police the next morning. They took my statement and the camera but didn't seem convinced. The officers said they would check it out, but I could tell they thought it was nothing more than a weird prank. I didn't push. I just left and drove home. Weeks later, I found a new folder on my laptop. I never put it there. It was filled with photos of me sleeping in my own apartment. And when I looked at the last photo, I saw something reflected in the window behind me. A shape standing in the dark, watching. Story 25. The diner sat just off the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly even though it was broad daylight. I pulled off the road more out of curiosity than anything else. The place didn't show up on any map I had checked, but it looked like it had been there for years. Dust coated the windows, and the front door hung slightly ajar as if inviting me in. I parked the car on the cracked asphalt lot and stepped out. The air was still, not even the hint of a breeze, and I didn't see another car anywhere nearby. Something about the silence made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just because the place had been empty for so long. I walked to the entrance and pushed open the door. Inside, the diner was dim. Light filtered through the windows just enough to cast long shadows across the cracked tile floor. The booths were covered in dust, but everything else looked like someone had simply walked out one day and never returned. Plates and cups were still on the tables. A single ceiling fan creaked slowly above me, though there was no power to keep it moving. I stepped further in, the door groaning as it shut behind me. The smell was strange, not rotten like I expected, but metallic and faintly sweet. It hung in the air and caught at the back of my throat. I tried not to think about it as I walked toward the counter. That's when I saw the menu board. It hung above the register where you normally expect to see the day's specials or prices for coffee and pie. But instead of food items, there were names. Dozens of them, each written in neat white letters. Some names had words next to them, processing, waiting, and then one word that made my skin crawl ready. I scanned the list, half thinking it was some weird joke or art piece, but then I found my name. My first and last name, clear as day, sitting at the bottom of the list, and next to it was that word, ready. I stepped back instinctively, knocking into one of the old stools. It scraped loudly across the floor. My heart hammered as I stared at the board, reading and rereading my name, hoping I was seeing it wrong. But there it was. It didn't change, and I didn't wake up from the dream I hoped this was. I forced myself to move. I walked behind the counter, looking for any sign of life or reason for what I was seeing. There was an old register, the drawer stuck half open. A coffee pot sat cold and empty on a hot plate. But there were no workers, no customers, only the quiet hum that seemed to come from nowhere at all. I glanced at the kitchen door. It was slightly open, swinging gently as if someone had passed through just before I arrived. I told myself to leave, that this wasn't worth finding out more. But something stronger than reason made me push forward. The kitchen was worse. Stainless steel counters were smeared with something dark, and there was an odd wetness to the tile floor. It smelled stronger in here, that metallic tang filling my nose until it made my stomach turn. There were knives lined neatly along one wall, gleaming even in the dim light, and in the far corner, a dumbwaiter door stood open. I couldn't make sense of any of it. There were no bodies, no signs of people, just the traces of something that had been here not long ago. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the room as I did. I turned to go back through the swinging door when I noticed something else. The chalkboard menu wasn't the only list. On the wall to my right, there was a clipboard with sheets of paper clipped to it. I pulled one free and looked at it. Columns of times and names, check marks beside some, lines through others. My name was there too, circled twice in red pen. That was enough. I dropped the paper and turned, moving quickly through the kitchen and back into the main dining area. But as I reached the front door, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. All of the plates on the tables were full now. Steaming dishes sat where dusty emptiness had been moments earlier. I didn't stop to see what was on them. I yanked the door open and stepped outside, sucking in the fresh air like I'd been underwater too long. My car was still there. I ran to it, unlocking it with shaking hands and climbing in. The engine groaned as I turned the key, but it started on the second try. As I backed out of the lot, I caught sight of the diner through the rearview mirror. The front door slowly swung shut on its own, and the neon sign flickered again, this time brighter, glowing red instead of its dull white. The letters rearranged themselves, spelling something I couldn't quite read before they blinked out completely. I drove without stopping for miles, only pulling over when I reached a rest area filled with other travelers. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the people around me, wondering if their names had ever been on a menu board like that, wondering if I had just been marked for something I didn't understand. That night, in a motel room far from the diner, I checked every window and locked the door twice. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the word ready beside my name, glowing faintly in the dark. I kept expecting a knock at the door or a whisper in the room, but there was nothing. In the morning, I packed up and kept driving, putting as much distance between me and that place as I could. I never found it again, no matter how much I searched. Other diners dotted the highway, but none looked the same. None had that heavy silence or that strange smell. But sometimes, when I pass an old roadside diner, I can't help but wonder if my name is still on a list somewhere, if it's still marked ready, and if one day I'll stop again and there won't be any way out. Story 26. The hospital sat at the edge of town, forgotten and half swallowed by overgrown trees. It had been abandoned for years, but people still whispered about it. They said strange things happened inside, stories of lights seen through broken windows and noises in the middle of the night. I never believed any of it, but that didn't stop me from wanting to see it for myself. Getting in wasn't hard. One of the back entrances was already open, its metal door bent and hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and rust. The hallways were cluttered with broken furniture, old equipment, and scattered papers, but it was quiet. My footsteps echoed as I moved, the sounds making me feel like I wasn't entirely alone. I wandered through what had once been the emergency room, stepping carefully around overturned gurneys and shattered glass. Some of the walls had been stripped of their paint, the plaster beneath cracked and crumbling. As I made my way deeper, I found patient rooms that were still furnished, though everything was coated in dust and grime. Some of the beds were still made, as if they had been waiting for someone to return. I was almost ready to leave when I found the nursery. The door stood closed at the end of a narrow hallway, its window smeared with dirt. When I pushed it open, it creaked loudly and I paused, listening for any sign that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing, just the steady thump of my own heartbeat in my ears. Inside, the nursery was dim, lit only by the pale light filtering through cracked blinds. Rows of small white cribs filled the room, each one lined up neatly as if still in use. At first, I thought they were empty, but as I stepped closer, I saw something resting inside each one. Dolls, old ones, their faces worn and faded, dressed in stained baby clothes. I stood still for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The dolls didn't seem unusual at first. Maybe they had been left behind when the hospital closed. But then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Each crib had a small name tag attached to the railing, handwritten in faded ink. Every tag had a full name and a date. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took out my phone. I snapped a picture of one of the tags and searched the name. The first result was a missing persons report, dated nearly 25 years ago. The child had disappeared without a trace. I checked another crib, then another. Each name I searched matched a missing child from around the same time. There were at least 20 cribs, maybe more. Each doll had been placed carefully, tucked in beneath tiny blankets. Some dolls had cracked porcelain faces, while others were made of plastic, their features distorted from age. But it was the names that unsettled me most. These weren't random toys left behind. Someone had put them here on purpose. I tried to reason through it. Maybe it was some kind of sick memorial. Maybe someone had made these dolls in memory of the missing children. But the longer I stood there, the less sense it made. The tags were too precise. The placement too deliberate. Whoever had done this had known their names, known when they had vanished. I walked slowly through the rows, reading each name as I went. The room was deathly silent, except for the faint groan of the old building settling. As I reached the last row of cribs, I noticed something different. One crib didn't have a doll. Instead, a small blanket was folded neatly inside, and a name tag was pinned to it. I recognized the name before I even read it aloud. It was mine. I stared at it for what felt like an hour, my mind trying to reject what I was seeing. My name. First and last, written in the same shaky handwriting as the others. A date was listed beneath it, a date that hadn't happened yet. My chest tightened as I realized what it meant. This wasn't just about the past. Someone had made plans for the future. I stepped back from the crib, my hands shaking. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, a cruel joke, but I knew that wasn't true. The room felt wrong, heavier with every breath I took. I turned to leave, forcing myself to move even as my legs felt like lead. As I crossed the threshold of the nursery door, I heard something, a soft sound like fabric brushing against wood. I turned my head slowly and saw one of the dolls lying on the floor, its crib empty. I didn't wait to see if it had fallen or been moved. I ran. The hallway seemed longer on the way out. Every door I passed felt like it was watching me. Shadows seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. I could hear faint noises, soft footsteps, or whispers, but I didn't stop to listen. My only thought was getting back outside, back to the safety of open air. When I finally burst through the broken door into daylight, I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I locked the doors, hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles were white. It was only when I was several miles away that I let myself breathe normally again. Since then, I haven't gone back. I told myself it was just a bad dream, that the stress of exploring an old hospital had gotten to me. But I still have the picture of the name tag saved on my phone. Every so often I look at it. My name, written in ink that looks fresher than it should. And the date underneath is getting closer. Story 27. The old mill had been converted into a house decades ago, or so the listing claimed. From the outside, it still looked like it belonged to another time. Weathered stone walls, tall, narrow windows, and a wheel out back that no longer turned. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were standing at the edge of something forgotten. I had been looking for a place out in the country, something quiet and remote. When the realtor showed me the property, I felt drawn to it in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the privacy or the history, it was something else. Something that made me sign the papers without giving it too much thought. For the first week, everything was fine. The house was cold but solid, the floorboards creaked but held. I spent most of my time downstairs, cleaning, unpacking, getting used to the long silences that came with living far from town. I didn't think much about the attic until I noticed the draft. It was on the 3rd floor, down a narrow hallway that seemed to get darker the farther you walked. The attic door had a heavy latch on it, the kind you'd see on a barn or an old cellar. It took some effort to lift, but it finally gave way with a sharp snap. The door groaned open, releasing a gust of air that smelled stale and dry like old paper and dust. I stood there for a long moment before stepping inside. The space was larger than I expected, with a slanted ceiling that made me duck in places. Sunlight pushed through a small window at the far end, cutting a line through the gloom. My flashlight beam passed over old trunks, furniture draped in sheets, and piles of things left behind by whoever had lived here before. Then I saw them. Against the far wall, lined up side by side, were a series of cages. They were made of thick metal, bolted to the floor, each one about the size of a small closet. My first thought was that they might have been for animals, though the bars seemed far too heavy for something like that. I walked closer, shining my light inside the nearest cage. Bones, dozens of them, small and brittle, arranged in a way that made my stomach turn. They weren't clean or polished like something from a museum. They were raw, some still dark with what looked like old tissue, dried and clinging. Each cage was the same. Some had more bones than others. In a few, the remains were piled together, as if they had been tossed there without care. Others looked almost deliberate, laid out in lines or circles I couldn't make sense of. I felt sick as I moved away from them, wiping my hand over my mouth to steady myself. Near the cages was a table, and on it sat a stack of journals. The covers were cracked and worn, the pages yellowed but intact. I picked one up and opened it to the first page. At the top was a neat heading, Subjects. Below it was a list of names, each followed by a number and a series of notes written in cramped, tidy handwriting. The entries were clinical in tone, as if whoever had written them saw nothing unusual in what they described. They mentioned things like acquisition successful and responded poorly to confinement. Some had dates that stretched back years. Others had phrases like long-term storage recommended or unsuitable for release. I flipped through several pages, feeling colder with every line I read. There were mentions of conditioning, preparation, and something called extraction, though it was never clear what that meant. The last few entries trailed off, the handwriting shakier, the notes shorter. Some pages were torn out completely, leaving only jagged edges behind. I set the journal down, not sure if I wanted to read any more. My hands were trembling, but I made myself open another book. This one was more detailed, with drawings in the margins. Diagrams of cages, tools, and figures that looked human but somehow wrong. Limbs too long, heads bent at unnatural angles, eyes sketched black. As I turned another page, I heard a sound behind me. A soft scrape, like something moving over wood. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing there. The cages sat still, the bones unmoving. I listened, holding my breath, but there was nothing else. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I backed away from the table and turned toward the door. As I reached it, I noticed something carved into the wood just beside the latch. Letters scratched deep, ragged and uneven. I leaned in to read them. Help us. The words hit me harder than anything else I'd found. I yanked the door open and hurried down the narrow stairs, barely keeping my balance as I went. I slammed the door shut behind me and threw the latch down hard, then stood there for a long time, listening. The house was silent again, but it didn't feel empty. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound the house made seemed sharper, closer. The wind against the windows, the creak of the floor settling, it all made my skin crawl. I kept thinking about those journals, about the cages, about the names listed inside, none of which I recognized. But there was space left on those lists. Enough for more names. The next day, I packed up everything I could and left. I didn't wait for an explanation. I didn't care about losing money on the sale. I just wanted to be gone. The old mill still stands there now, empty again as far as I know. But sometimes I think about whoever wrote those notes, about what they were doing up there in that attic and why they needed cages. I wonder if they're still out there somewhere or if they ever really left. And I wonder if someone else will open that door one day and find a journal with their own name inside, under the heading of subjects. Story 28. The amusement park had been closed for decades. I found it by accident while hiking through an old overgrown trail that wasn't on my map. The rusted gate creaked when I pushed it open, revealing crumbling rides and faded signs swallowed by weeds. I decided to set up camp nearby, curiosity tugging at me even as something inside told me to leave. After pitching my tent just beyond the fence line, I spent the evening exploring what remained of the place. The roller coaster tracks loomed like broken ribs against the darkening sky, and the skeletal remains of food stands sat quiet and hollow. It should have felt like a graveyard, but something about it didn't. Lights flickered faintly on one of the buildings ahead, pulsing softly in the dusk. It was the funhouse. The faded sign above the entrance swayed slightly in the breeze, the words "House of Mirrors" barely legible. I told myself the lights were probably old emergency systems powered by dying batteries. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was waiting for me. My footsteps crunched on broken glass as I walked closer. Inside, it smelled of dust and rusted metal. The air was warmer than outside, thick and stale. Lights ran along the edges of the mirrors, glowing in a way that wasn't quite steady. They buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the warped reflections that lined the room. I stood still at first, watching my reflection multiply 100 times in front of me. The mirrors stretched and bent my image, twisting me into strange shapes. Some made me laugh softly under my breath, remembering how these places were meant to be fun. But then I noticed something strange in one of the mirrors at the far end of the room. In that reflection, I wasn't laughing. I wasn't moving at all. My reflection stood perfectly still, arms at its sides, staring back at me with an expression I wasn't making. I raised my hand slowly, testing it. My reflection didn't move. It just stayed there, its mouth slowly curving into a wide smile. I took a step back, heart pounding suddenly in my chest. I turned to leave, but when I glanced back at the mirror, the reflection was still watching me. Its smile grew wider, stretching unnaturally across its face. The lights in the room flickered faster, casting shadows that jumped and twitched at the edges of my vision. I hurried toward the entrance, but the path I had come in from was gone. The mirrors had shifted, creating a maze I didn't remember walking through. Every direction I turned showed more versions of me, but none of them moved the way I did. Some stood still, some turned away, and others pressed their hands flat against the glass as if trying to get out. I tried to focus on the floor, hoping to find a path without thinking about the reflections. But the ground was warped too. Funhouse mirrors stretched beneath my feet, reflecting endless versions of myself looking up with blank stares. I felt dizzy, like the whole room was tilting underneath me. Then I heard something behind me. Not footsteps, but a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across glass. I turned slowly, expecting to see anything, but there was only another wall of mirrors. Except one reflection was closer than it should have been, pressed right up against the glass on the other side. It was me, but not. Its eyes were wrong, too dark, and its grin too wide. It raised a hand and placed it against the glass. A moment later, I felt a cold pressure against my shoulder, as if something had touched me. I spun around, but nothing was there, just the reflections staring back, their smiles widening in unison. I ran then, stumbling through the twisting maze of mirrors. The reflections grew more distorted as I went, their mouths opening wider until they were gaping maws, their teeth sharp and shining. Some of them slammed their hands against the glass, cracks spider-webbing out from where they hit. The sound of shattering followed me as I ran. I didn't know how I found the exit, but suddenly I was outside again. The door slammed shut behind me, and the lights inside flickered one last time before going dark. I stood there, gasping for air, my hands shaking violently. The funhouse loomed silent again, as if nothing had happened. I didn't go back to my tent. I grabbed my pack and started walking, pushing through the underbrush without caring where I ended up. I just wanted to get away from that place. The trees closed in around me as I hiked deeper into the forest, not stopping until daylight broke through the branches. When I finally allowed myself to rest, I checked my reflection in a small creek. My face looked pale but otherwise normal. I splashed cold water on it, trying to shake the feeling that something was still watching me. But as I leaned closer to the water, I saw something that made me freeze. My reflection didn't move with me. It smiled, slowly, deliberately, just like before. I stumbled back from the water, falling hard on the rocks. When I looked again, the reflection was gone, just ripples on the surface of the stream. I made it to the nearest town by nightfall. I told myself I would forget about the amusement park, about the fun house and the mirrors. But every time I pass a window or a mirror, I catch myself watching closely, waiting to see if the reflection smiles first. Sometimes it does. Story 29. The lighthouse stood at the edge of a jagged cliff, its white peeling in long strips that flapped in the sea wind. I had agreed to watch over it for a month while repairs were being planned. The owners said it hadn't been in regular use for years, but they needed someone to keep an eye on the place. I thought it would be peaceful, just me, the ocean, and a chance to get away from everything. The inside was colder than I expected. The walls were damp to the touch, and the floorboards creaked under my weight as I carried my bags up the narrow spiral stairs. The kitchen was small but clean, stocked with a few supplies and a kettle. There was a desk against the far wall with a pile of old logbooks stacked beside it, their spines cracked and faded from age. The first few nights were quiet enough. The wind howled outside constantly, but I got used to it. The sea below crashed against the rocks with a steady rhythm that lulled me to sleep. I read books during the day, cooked simple meals, and sat by the window at night, watching the beam of the lighthouse sweep slowly over the waves. On the fourth night, I noticed something odd in the logbooks. The entries dated back decades, each keeper recording daily weather, ship sightings, and lighthouse maintenance. But about a year ago, the tone of the logs shifted. The writing became rushed, the handwriting shaky. Mentions of missing visitors began to appear. At first, it was small things. A boat seen drifting near the cliffs, its passengers gone. A group of hikers who never returned from the trail that wound behind the cliffs. Then the entries became more frequent. Every few weeks, another disappearance. The names of the missing were scrawled in the margins as if the keeper didn't want to forget. I kept reading, the entries growing darker the closer they got to the present. Whoever had written them had grown paranoid, convinced that something was watching from the sea. The last few pages were filled with desperate warnings. The final entry was written in thick, uneven letters. "They'll come for you next." I closed the book slowly, my skin cold despite the blanket around my shoulders. I stood up and checked the doors, making sure they were locked. I told myself it was just old stories, a man left alone too long with his thoughts. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. The wind seemed louder, and I kept thinking I heard footsteps on the stairs. I tried to tell myself it was the old wood shifting in the cold. But around midnight, I heard something knock against the front door. 3 slow, heavy thuds. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting to hear it again. But it never came. The next morning, I found footprints in the sand outside. They led from the water's edge up to the door. There were no prints leading away. The tide was low, and the footprints were deep, like whoever made them had been heavy or carrying something. I stared at them for a long time before brushing them away with my boot. I thought about leaving, but the boat wasn't scheduled to come back for 2 more weeks. There was no cell service out here, and the radio was too old to work. I told myself I could manage. I'd stay inside at night and keep the doors locked. It was only 2 weeks. But things got worse. Every night, I heard sounds outside. Sometimes it was scratching at the walls, faint but steady. Other times it was a low humming, almost like a voice beneath the wind. The lighthouse beams started flickering even though I hadn't touched the controls. The light would go out for long stretches, and I'd sit there in the dark, waiting. One night I woke to find the door to my room wide open. I knew I had locked it. I always locked it. But there it was, swinging gently in the breeze that shouldn't have been there. I got up and shut it again, pushing the dresser in front of it for good measure. The rest of the night I heard footsteps just beyond the door. They never tried to get in, but they paced back and forth for hours. I stopped using the logbooks after that. There didn't seem much point. I knew they were coming, whoever or whatever they were. I spent my days trying to stay awake and my nights listening for sounds I couldn't explain. My food was running low, but I was too afraid to leave the lighthouse to check the old supply shed. A few days before the boat was due, I noticed something new. There was a ship on the horizon, sitting still in the water. No flag, no movement. Just a dark shape, barely visible in the gray mist. It had been there when I woke up, and it was still there as the sun went down. The next day, it was closer. That night, I saw figures on the rocks below. They didn't move like people. They stood too still, their bodies tall and thin, heads tilted up toward the lighthouse. I watched them from the window, not daring to move. They stayed there until the first light of dawn, then vanished like smoke. The ship was closer again the next morning. I could see its hull now, rusted and blackened, with no sign of life aboard. I sat by the window with the logbook in my lap, turning the last pages over in my hand. I thought about writing something, leaving a warning for the next person. But I didn't know what to say. That night I heard the footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, climbing one step at a time. I pushed the dresser tighter against the door and held my breath. They stopped just outside. Then came the sound of breathing, slow and deep. It stayed there for hours. When morning came, I found the door torn from its hinges. The room was cold and wet, like seawater had poured in during the night. I walked to the window and saw the ship now just offshore. Figures stood on its deck, watching. The beam of the lighthouse no longer worked. I don't know if the boat ever came back for me. I lost track of the days after that. The logbook is still here, open to that last page. Sometimes I hear someone walking up the stairs again. Other times I hear the breathing right behind me. I don't turn around anymore. Story 30. The old farmhouse had been abandoned for as long as anyone in town could remember. It sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields that had long since gone wild, their weeds twisting high and thick. The house itself leaned precariously to one side, its roof sagging and shutters dangling loose on their hinges. I had always wanted to take a look inside, though people warned me to stay away. One overcast afternoon, I finally gave in to curiosity. I parked my car at the edge of the property and made my way through the tall grass, feeling it scrape against my jeans as I walked. The front porch groaned beneath my weight, and the screen door nearly fell off when I pulled it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and a faint, unpleasant odor I couldn't quite place. Most of the rooms on the first floor were empty, stripped bare of furniture except for a few broken chairs and an old table that sagged in the middle. A faded wallpaper peeled away in long strips, revealing cracked wood beneath. As I moved through the house, the boards creaked loudly underfoot, and I found myself glancing back over my shoulder more than once. It felt like someone was watching, though I knew I was alone. In the kitchen, I found the entrance to the root cellar. The wooden door was flush with the floor and had a rusted iron handle. I hesitated for a moment, but then I gripped the handle and pulled. It took some effort, but the door finally creaked open, releasing a stale, cold draft that smelled of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed the beam into the darkness. Wooden stairs descended into the cellar, slick with moss and age. I took each step carefully, gripping the railing as I went, the wood soft and splintering beneath my fingers. At the bottom, the space opened into a wide room, the walls lined with shelves. At first, I thought the jars were just old preserves. They were lined up neatly, each one sealed tightly, glass cloudy with age. But when I stepped closer and wiped the dust away from one of them, my stomach clenched. Inside was something pale, floating in cloudy liquid. It took me a few seconds to realize I was looking at a human hand, fingers slightly curled, nails darkened. Each jar contained something different. Some held feet, others hands, and a few had what looked like internal organs, all in varying states of preservation. Every jar had a small tag attached to it with careful handwriting, listing a date. I ran my fingers over one of the tags and read the date aloud. It was from over 50 years ago. I moved slowly along the shelves, reading each label as I passed. The dates spanned decades, getting more recent as I continued toward the back of the room. My mouth went dry as I noticed a jar that looked much newer than the others. The glass was clear, the seal tight, and the label freshly written. I leaned in closer to read it and felt my skin crawl. The date on the tag was today's. The jar contained something pale and bloated. At first I thought it was just another hand, but as I squinted through the murky liquid, I realized it was something else entirely. It was an ear, severed cleanly, with a small hoop earring still attached. The earring glinted faintly under the beam of my flashlight, and my heart raced as I recognized it. I backed away quickly, nearly tripping over a loose stone on the floor. My breathing was loud in the silence, and I forced myself to stay calm. The air in the cellar felt colder now, like the temperature had dropped suddenly. I shined my flashlight around the room again, feeling like I was missing something, and then I heard a faint scraping sound from somewhere above me. I turned toward the stairs and saw nothing at first. Then a shadow passed across the doorway at the top, slow and deliberate. My pulse pounded in my ears as I shut off my flashlight and pressed myself back against the shelves, hoping the darkness would hide me. The cellar door creaked again, this time closing with a soft but final thud. For several minutes I stood there, listening. Footsteps moved across the floor above, slow and heavy, as if someone was searching the rooms I had just explored. I tried to steady my breathing, but it felt too loud in the quiet. The footsteps paused, and then they were moving again, this time toward the cellar door. I heard the latch click, and then it sounded like something heavy was placed on top of the door. Whoever was up there didn't want me leaving. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to think clearly. My phone had no signal down here, and shouting would probably make things worse. I turned my flashlight back on and scanned the room for another way out. In the far corner of the cellar, partially hidden behind shelves, was a small opening in the stone wall. It was just big enough for me to crawl through, but I had no idea where it led. Still, it was the only option I had. I hurried over to it, wincing as the flashlight beam wobbled with my shaking hands. The opening was damp, the edges slick with moss. I crawled through the narrow space, my shoulders scraping against rough stone. The tunnel was dark, the smell of earth and rot stronger here. I kept moving, dragging myself forward until the tunnel widened enough to let me crouch. After what felt like forever, I saw faint light ahead. I quickened my pace and finally emerged into an overgrown section of the field behind the farmhouse. I didn't stop to rest. I ran through the tall grass, not caring about the scratches on my arms or the branches whipping against my face. I didn't slow down until I reached my car and locked myself inside. My hands trembled as I started the engine and peeled away from the property, dust kicking up behind me. I never went back to that farmhouse. Sometimes I still dream about the cellar, about the jars lined up neatly on the shelves. I think about the ear in the jar marked with today's date and wonder how it got there. And sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear slow, heavy footsteps outside my window.